Good afternoon, everyone. We'll go ahead and call the work session to order. And before we move on with the agenda, we're going to stand up and pledge of allegiance. So if you would join me, thank you. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. So we'll start out by saying thank you to the staff and everyone that's involved with preparing our information today. And looks like we have quite a few things on the agenda. The goal is 4:30. I think we can get it done. Yeah. Don't think so? Yeah. We'll see. All right. We'll go ahead and move forward with the stormwater utility fee tier option. Mr. Evan Kirk.
Thank you, Mayor. My name is Evan Kirk. I'm the stormwater utility coordinator. I've seen a couple of the council members last week, so thank you again for having me back. I'll be very brief and feel free to ask questions if you want me to go into more detail. That way I can leave time for you to cover the electric rates today. So just real quickly, what is a fifth tier? So one of the council members proposed that we add a fifth tier to our stormwater utility fee. We currently have 4 tiers. This will be a fifth in order to improve the equity of the way in which revenues are distributed amongst our residential customers. Fifth tier would cover larger homes in Apex, and there will be about 800, depending on where we set that fifth tier start point. 5,400 is what I proposed as a staff member, just because that would be the point in which we cross over 2 equivalent residential units, 2 ERUs, 2 average size homes for impervious surface area. I'll go over 2 options. I came to the working group last week with what was essentially option 1, which is at that point we charge residential customers in that fifth tier as if they're non-residential customers. So they would be charged a uniform or per ERU rate, where they would essentially pay for every square foot of impervious on their parcel prorated. The second option, which was proposed in that working session, is to have a fifth tier flat rate, which would just be another tier added on to our current rate structure, where we would come to an agreement on what they would be charged as a council and among staff, and I've kind of proposed that that could be anywhere between $2 and $5, so you can see what that does. Pros and cons of a fifth tier. Fifth tier, the number 1 pro is it provides increased equity amongst residential customers. It's only going to be a modest rate increase, even for those that are in the fifth tier. For option 1, every single square foot of impervious that someone adds in that fifth tier would be charged for. So there would be, we would see increased revenue, but also small negative incentive or disincentive for folks in that fifth tier to add impervious to their parcels. So there would be a little bit of a hit on their wallet. I guess people might be a little bit disincentivized to add impervious if they're in that fifth tier, which is a good thing for our water quality in the town. The revenues that we would see from adding the fifth tier, depending on the option you choose and the rate we set for that option, would be anywhere between 24 and 50,000, which is anywhere between 1 and 2% of our current revenue. So we wouldn't be doing this for the purpose of increasing our revenues. It would be for that equity purpose. Cons, there is administrative cost. The biggest administrative cost is setting it up in the first place. These 800 properties need to be edited in New World, their billing manually. We also need to develop a communications plan, which we have a draft already for, and implement that communication plan to educate our customers in that fifth tier about what it is, why we're doing it, and how it affects them. Ongoing administrative costs. We already do these true ups for all properties in the town, looking with satellite imagery if their impervious has changed and whether or not that impacts their bill. For the fifth tier option 1, we would have to do that for all properties in that fifth tier. Any change in impervious would impact their bill. If we choose option 2, which is the flat rate, then once they're in that fifth tier, their bill will never change. So we can effectively ignore those properties moving forward unless our rate structure itself changes. And then there's some small potential for pushback. We're not planning on broadcasting this to the town at large in a large outreach campaign because there was a little bit of misunderstanding. I understand there was a Facebook thread at one point for the initial stormwater utility fee. We're only going to be communicating to the customers that are impacted by this, with the exception of discussing it in in the budgetary hearing and in the circulation, advertising that hearing in a paper of general circulation. Quickly, our communication plan is direct outreach to those customers using mailers, some stormwater utility fee website updates. And this would be required for either of the changes, but a public notice of hearing. Implementation, that would be my job, along with Adam in finance, editing in New World, the bills, updating the GIS, working with Aaron's communications on the website, and then ongoing drill team part of my job. We see 3 to 6 months. Staff recommends that if we move forward with option 1 or option 2, that this is a mid fiscal year rollout. So January 1, 2024 is when we would be able to get everything, get all our ducks in a row to get it. Option 1 is if you're a non-resident property, $25,000 per year in additional revenue. And this is what it would look like on our fee schedule. $5 per ERU is after 2 ERUs. That's when the bill would start going north of $10. So that's why we chose 5,400 as option 2. It's option 1's cutoff point for tier 5.
Hold on, real quick. So if it's 5,500, that roughly turns out to be 10, 20 or something like that. It's like, once they go above that, it's right gonna be at 10, right? It's like,
Yeah, so tier 4 stops at 5,400 square feet. Someone who has 5,401 square feet would be getting charged $10.01-ish.
okay,
And then, so that's why the 5,400 is a cutoff point, because that's the point where if you charge them as a non-residential customer, then their bill would be above $10.
it's not a step change. It's like right at that point. It's not a step change at that
Right.
point. It's like a gradual. Okay.
Yeah, so at this point, the bill becomes prorated. So for every single square foot of impervious, we're gonna just multiply that by $5, or you have to convert it to ERUs, and then you multiply it by $5.
Okay.
So we don't round up at any point. We round up in the tiers. So if you're at 1,502 square feet, you get charged $5, even though someone at 2,999 is going to get charged the same. But in this, you would get charged at a prorated rate. So we wouldn't be rounding up at that point.
That's good.
Majority of the bill increases would be less than $3. And we kind of agreed that anything less than $1 is essentially the same. And that's the vast majority of customers would see a bill increase less than $1. Option 2, fixed rate at that 5th tier. Kind of proposed, since the stepwise for these was $250, that might be the starting point of thinking about what we would add. Also have to keep in mind that there are some properties that are much larger than other properties in that 5th tier. Within the first 4 tiers, there's not much variance, but in that 5th tier, there's an incredible amount of variance. Standard deviation is very high. And so that's why we might even consider something as high as $5 for that 5th tier. And that's what it looked like to be a $15 flat fee. So this is a discussion slide, kind of just laid out a summary of what we've discussed. There is an option 3, is do nothing. Leave it as is. Doesn't prohibit us doing something in the future. And again, there will be no added administrative burden, but we still are doing those true ups on all the properties. And so there's still some level of administrative burden that wouldn't change if we instituted option 1 and option 2 or option 2. So the per ERU, let's just recap. Per ERU is the most equitable, especially amongst those 5th tier customers. That way, someone who has 5,401 square feet isn't paying the same bill as someone who has 16,000 square feet. So just think about that from an equity standpoint in that tier. We would see a medium increased revenue from the per ERU option. There is the most administrative burden, but that's not to say it's a high administrative burden. It's just comparatively to option 2, it's more administrative burden. And then it is a little bit more difficult to communicate to the public, why are we being charged a non-residential rate? We might choose to not use that terminology. We might choose to say a per ERU rate for customers in that 5th tier. Communications, we can work together on the language. Option 2, it is more equitable than the status quo. It has the most increased revenue, but it also has the potential to be the same increased revenue. If we choose that 250, it's the same. It's about $25,000. If we choose that 5, it's about double that. It's about 50,000. There is administrative burden to that, especially in implementing it at the start. And it's easier for the public to understand. We're just adding a 5th tier. We already have 4 tiers. It's not any different than the status quo. So if there are questions or discussion, then we can open it up for that.
And so, kind of new to the conversation here, so the measurement, like the 5,400 square foot is, you know, if you're looking down, basically impervious surface, so the driveway, the house itself, patios, like whatever comes into the play, right?
Yes, sir.
Okay. I have no idea how much 5,400 square foot is relative to,
Oh, 800 people in town.
yeah, so it's not a whole lot.
It's the Buckinghams, Belcasas, the Abingtons. I did a map of, I was looking at the neighborhoods where this is.
Charge
placed. Well, this is my idea. That's what I want to do.
Disagree?
For me, it was the tail. So number one catches the tail. The tail was what bothered me more than the 5th tier by itself. It was like, there were some like 10,000 square foot things or bigger or more that were getting charged the same as they were for a 5,000 square foot house or a 5,000 square foot impervious. And I was like, you know, the people that are on this tail, you know, they're not many of them, but they should pay a lot more, I thought.
Yeah, and that's a great point. The 5th tier, option 2, there's nothing that prohibits us from adding a 6th, 7th tier besides administrative work. But the option 2, to get to your point, doesn't do as good of a job of capturing that tail because we're charging everybody in that 5th tier the same rate. But we can also change where that cutoff point is. So my data here, the 2,400 to 48,000 and the 800 customers is based off of that 5,400 square foot cutoff point. We could set that at 6,000, 6,500. Then we're catching far few, and I can get that data as well. But the majority of the people in that 5th tier, go to this graph, are clustered in probably 6,200 square feet or less. And so if we were to go 6,200 or more or 6,000 or more, then we're catching maybe 300, 350 customers. And that would get to more catching that tail.
And so what's the objective here, right? So like having things being more equitable, right? I can get behind that, right? The revenue is insignificant, right?
It's not
The cost is going to
revenue.
offset the revenue easily. So what's the gain?
Hold on. That's probably not right.
I mean, like,
The first year maybe.
Yeah, no, I would say that even in the first year, the revenue would offset the administrative costs of my staff time and my colleagues' staff time. But you're right that the revenue is insignificant in the grand scheme of things. We're not doing this for increased revenue.
and so, but you know, for you to monitor 1,000 homes, right, from the air, recalculate the purpose, or you know, every single year, you know, that's a time investment, right? That's time that you could spend otherwise. So it's not necessarily an increased cost to the town, but it's you know, time that could be spent in other areas that is now going through administrative work to maintain this tier structure, right? So at 24, you know, 24,000 is not a whole lot to offset that, you know, that, you know, diversion of labor hours, right? So if at the end of the day, right, we're not coming up with more funding to fix our stormwater management, why are we doing this?
Well, maybe can I clear? You didn't put a dollar amount on the administrative cost thing, and you didn't. Can you explain the true up that we're doing right now versus the true up that would be required if we go like to option
It's essentially
one?
the same thing.
Yeah.
So I'm looking at every property in the town and we have polygons drawn over the aerial imagery. And I can just see, oh, there's a patio that's outside that polygon. I have to edit the polygon and then recalculate. The area is calculated for me automatically in the GIS. And then just see if that changes the build. Adding the 5th tier will increase the number of times it changes the build. But I've already done true ups and I can say that even when the property changes impervious, fewer than 10% actually trigger a build change. And so the work is not as tedious as you might think. And the staff time it's my job already to do that. And I've been doing this as well. $24,000 vastly exceeds the cost for me to do it. And that cost is already there anyway, because I'm already doing it.
That was part of the reason why we requested the option 2, thinking it would require less administration as part of this and less burden on staff. This is having to calculate it each and every time. So that's why that option 2 came out of the last work session.
So the notes I wrote, roughly along the same line as Arnold's questions, is what problem are we actually trying to solve here? We mentioned equity. The current system we set up, we designed to be an equitable system. Like a lot of towns do a flat fee across everybody. We set up this tier system. You know, have we gotten feedback? Do we believe that the 4 tiers are inequitable to a point where it's problematic and we have to address it? Like is 4 bad and 5's okay? Why not 6 or 7 or 8? You know, for the amount of additional revenue, I guess what I would say, you know, when we talk about equity, we're not actually decreasing the cost for anyone else in the other tiers. So I thought if there is an equity complaint about people in the lower tiers about, you know, this guy with a 30,000 square feet of impervious surface, he's not paying as much. I think they care less about him paying more than them paying less. Like if we're like that, to my comment at the meeting is like, are we lowering any of the costs? If we're not lowering the costs, I don't think anyone's going to care. I don't think anyone's begging on the door to do that. I'm also concerned about like a change for the sake of a change that's not providing additional revenue, not really solving a problem. In a year where we're going to have a really challenging budget where we're raising a bunch of other fees. This is going to be another bullet item on the list this year for what's going to be a pretty hard to communicate budget to our citizens. And if we're going to do that, I'm not opposed to it. You know, like you had the chart earlier, the vast majority of people it's not going to affect. I'm talking about a really small slice of people, like dozens, who are going to have a measurably increased bill. And it seems like a lot of effort that doesn't solve a problem and kind of contributes to the narrative that we're just raising all the rates for the sake of doing it. So can you describe the ongoing revenue increase? Like, do you have an estimate of the 5-year average revenue increase from doing this?
I don't, but when someone adds impervious to their parcel, it's typically less than 1,000 square feet of additional impervious, just with my anecdotal knowledge of permits that come through for accessory structures, pools, and for additions. And so 1,000 square feet is less than $2 per month. And so it's the ongoing increased revenue. I suppose it would slightly increase our revenue over time, like it would make the slope higher, but it
The
wouldn't.
net revenue that I'm asking about.
Yeah.
Minus administrative cost.
It's positive.
I had another question, actually, along. Because you mentioned the permitting thing. Because another point when I was trying to think about what problem we're trying to solve here is you mentioned providing an incentive for people to have lower amount of impervious surface. And I think in practice, I don't think anyone's going to be like, should I get a pool? Well, you know, it's 30 grand or whatever, but I have to pay another $1.50 a month. So maybe I won't do that. Like, I don't think that's going to happen. But if there was a larger upfront cost, then maybe people would think twice about what kind of pool they build. So what I'm wondering is, do we have any authority to charge or do we charge fees for impervious surface changes like at permitting time? So when someone goes to apply for whatever permits they need for pool, we say, well, actually you owe us $1,500. And that might affect based on the size of your pool or something. I think that would more directly speak to the incentive portion of the program than $1 a month or whatever. So I don't know if you know, or Flora, if we have any authority to do that. So that could be a thing.
I would think that'd be legally dubious because costs like that have to be proportional to the cost incurred by the town for administering the program or administering a service. And so
Unless permitting costs have to be fixed with our costs and not with impact or whatever of the thing.
Unless we had to implement a specific project that was directly caused by that increase in impervious, then we could charge that to the customer in some capacity through a capacity development fee or through a special assessment district. But I've never heard of like an upfront fee for impervious by loan.
So how many units are in that first tier, like the 0 to 400?
Let me go back here. It's,
or 400 to 1,500.
fewer than 2,500, about 2,200 units. And it's in tier one.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, so, if we're talking about equity, right, if that's the play that we're making here, because again, we're not doing this for financial purposes necessarily. Can we add tier 5 and set the rates for tier 1 to $0? So you basically taxing the people that can afford it, giving the people with, smaller properties a break.
We could set it lower, but I think it would be legally dubious to set it at $0 because we can't set the fee based off of income or other protected classes. And that would be kind of indirectly getting at that could bring up a legal challenge. But we could lower it, could make it $1.25 or $1.
25%. I mean, I don't know.
So when I proposed this, I was thinking $25,000 a year, which is not very much, but every year. So it adds up like, after 4 years, you get $100,000 to do a big project. But that was just from the top 1%, which was the appealing part to me about it. They're the only ones affected by it. That money, instead of doing a big project every so often, goes back into the lowest tier. That's fine with me. They're already paying less. It's already pretty low. So I don't think they would appreciate it very much. Honestly, it's only like $1.50 right now a month. I just don't think anybody sees that really. So.
No, but let's face it, like people that have these larger properties are not going to see the $5 either. So
that's why I also proposed it. I think
right,
pushback is actually.
I like the idea, right? So don't get me wrong. I'm just trying to figure out what we're doing it for. If the net effect, the net impact of it is small.
Sounds like a solution in search of a problem with them.
It was $25,000 a year from the top 1%.
Yeah,
That's what it was.
I don't think they care. I just think it's a conversation that we could not have if we choose not to. And I think no one's asked us to have this conversation. And so that'd be my preference for this year at least. And if we do it, and I'm not opposed to at some point in the future raising the rates, I assume they go up eventually.
But
I think it should be tied to, I think it should be tied to increased service or a specific project. We say we need to raise an additional $100,000 this year for stormwater, so we're going to adjust the rates this way to bring in $100,000. And this can be a way to increase the revenue. But to increase the revenue without tying it to a project other than we just think they should pay more, I think that again, what problem are we trying to solve there?
I foresee we have millions of dollars in undone projects in stormwater, maybe multiple millions of dollars. I don't know the number, but like every little bit helps. So I thought try to tackle that large backlog.
I don't disagree with you. There's a lot of stormwater projects that need to be done that can be very costly in order to manage them. So
I was imagining every year we'd use this on like some of the smaller ones though, like knock out a couple of small ones each year. I don't know how much things cost like for a small project, but in the room. But
we do have for FY24, part of what's in the budget is an assessment, which will help identify what those projects are so that we can begin to map out what the CIP for the stormwater fund looks like. So it's hard for us to speak to that right now because that's just not information we have until that assessment's completed. And that's planned for the upcoming year, the phase 1 of that.
do we feel like there's a bunch of like $20,000 projects, just kind of very small ones that?
Not a project or anything.
It's pretty small, but a project, Marty, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think in that ballpark was, there was a stabilization of a culvert in downtown, and I forget what street it was on, but that project alone was about 15,000, but it's something that people see stabilize the street. The street was starting to fall in at the corner. That's a stormwater project that we use stormwater dollars for. That's in that ballpark, and there are plenty of those around town. We're already, as Amanda said, we're already identifying projects in the future, but we already have work order, or in our system, we already have projects that have been identified that we're going to be doing in the coming years.
So great discussion, and I guess my question is, I appreciate you presenting this in the spirit of equity, and I think that's probably going to be a consistent theme today. But as we move forward, what do you need from us right now? Do you need a decision today?
I don't necessarily need the decision today. Certainly, if there's further discussion, and I don't know. I don't know when the decision is made in, if it's made in a meeting like this, if it's made in a more formal meeting. So certainly, I'm happy to take a decision today, because then I can start preparing.
If we want to start January of next year, we probably just, it needs to be in the budget.
Yes.
Okay.
Let's make a decision today.
My preference is that we move forward with this. My preference is to make it as easy as possible. So option 2 would be what I would prefer.
I would just add, I'm not gonna repeat my earlier comments, but another thing I want to point out, we just started this program. It's in its second year. It was fairly complicated, required a lot of explaining to do. For us to come back this year, make it more complicated and to try to communicate well with this new tier and this other rating without actually solving a problem, I think isn't useful, in my opinion. I think if there was a list of projects, like, listen, we're not doing this stuff because we don't have enough funds, and we need to raise another 50 grand or 100 grand a year, and use a strategy to do it. That's a directed action that I can get behind. This feels like speculative, and with all the other stuff going on in this budget, it's a discussion. I'd rather wait till we had more concrete plans in place.
Well, are you saying the communication, are you 3, or do you want the communication plan to be very clearly stating some of the examples of projects that are going to?
I am saying option 3 this year.
Option 3 this year. Okay.
Option 3, Matt. Councilman Gray.
Think through the long-term impact of this, because we can always add on. I'm in favor of option 2. I like that.
It's a clarifying question. And Evan, you stated so basically somebody or anyone in the system right now, you have to go back and look based on a permit that's applied for to do an addition. You have to go back and look at that particular residence to determine how much, whether or not it's going to change their tier. Is that correct?
Yeah, so there's both permitted changes in impervious, accessory structures, additions, pools, and there are unpermitted changes in impervious. You don't need a permit for a patio. You don't need a permit for a driveway, parking pad. You don't need a permit for other changes in.
What is our approach to looking at those? That's more like every 5 year looking at.
Yeah, so the town has planning districts, and the preliminary approach, until I get a good sense of what the workload actually is to look at 20% of the town per year. So I think there are 12 planning districts, so about 3 plan districts per year.
So, so when you have to do this work, you're having to look at this impervious percentage. So you would be only taking out a small amount of work, if you will, because people don't come in for additions that often, right? So I just don't know that, once you get into that 5th tier, you don't have to do anything, but I'll just point out there's like 500 or so customers that are going to go up on this side to instead of them going up less than $1, they're going to go up to $5. So they're going to be paying $4 more than they would have versus the few that have large expansions that would be the bigger ones. So I just want to make sure that that's very, very clear that this is kind of a reverse equitable thing where back to your tells, you got 827 under, if you just pay exactly what you owe, well, for your impervious, that would go up less than $1. Those 827 are going to go up $5 or $2.50 right out of the gate, so that's your decision. But it looks like to me there's more impact doing a set fee than doing a $5 per fee. From a professional perspective, it is easier to explain you're paying per impervious that you have once you get to that cutoff of your ERU. That's a typically industry standard type thing. It's not very often, Evan, correct me if I'm wrong, that you see industry standard where you have gone above the ERU and you're charging them less than what you might be charging commercial, because it's all that equivalent residential unit is a key term, and the thing with stormwater is your fees have to be defendable on why you're doing what you're doing. So I think that's important to make sure we understand.
Flat fee will make it more difficult.
I think it's less defendable.
Everybody's paying the same thing,
What, I
whether
mean,
you're
it's
at 5,500 or 10,000.
I
correct.
mean, why are 5 tiers of flat fees indefensible at 4 tiers of flat fees?
It's, the gaps are much smaller. I mean, and two, at this point, you've taken your ERU of 2,700 and now you've surpassed going way above that. And so it's, again, if you just look at your fee structure, the 5,400 to $10 is when you're equivalent. So we're saying if you go above that, you're going to pay for anything above your ERU, essentially. That's essentially what you're saying, which I think is more defendable from what I've seen in typical billing structure. But we can do anything that he wants to do. I just want to make sure those 2 points were kind of very clear.
No, you convinced me. I'm changing option one.
All right, so even if we were to collect enough funds to do additional projects, do we have capacity to do additional projects? Do we have the staff to go do that?
Stormwater is a unique thing because we have operational, so we have an operational side and an engineering side. So you got public works and you have water resources. So there's a lot of work that can be done that's internal, and it's buying riprap and things that we would do internal to address dissipator pads or energy pads at the end of, which is one of the things that we have a lot of things that we have to address. This places, it's just buying riprap, right? Truckloads of rock and placing it, and the filter fabric that goes underneath it. All those things cost. So this helps address those more than it does us going and doing a stream restoration.
It pays for the material cost.
It will help, yes. I mean, I can't put my finger and tell you what, but it addresses those type costs. And the other thing, it's a new fund. So anything that's not spent can help build reserve because there is no reserve in that fund, right? And then thirdly is we're having this assessment, conditional assessment done now. We're in the process of getting that contract going, where the town will be looking at that in phases. Because it's very expensive to look at that. That will define maintenance projects, like things we just need to address, versus projects that may be like new projects. So stormwater, you've got maintenance and then you have new. Okay. So
Last question, is it fair to assume that the lots with the larger impervious surfaces are typically the bigger homes?
Yes.
So if so different funds probably, right? If we raise property tax rates, we cannot use that for stormwater management.
We legally can, but we're not going to because we have stormwater utilities.
So we were directed to set up a utility fund for stormwater that would be self-supporting, fully funded, to using stormwater fees to do stormwater activities. So the direction we had worked on previously is we would not use tax dollars for stormwater. Now, you can do that if that's what you direct us to do, but what you cannot do is you cannot use stormwater fees that we collect for stormwater
General fund.
for anything
My
outside.
point is, like, rather than needling the residents, like, one little increase at a time, right? If we need to increase property tax rate anyway to make our budget need, right, let's just do it all at once, right? And it kind of factor it into the calculation. Again, anywhere between $25,000 and $50,000, like it's just not really material. It doesn't really help us address this thing or that thing. Okay, it buys a truck of gravel, great. It helps, but I'm struggling with this one, to be honest with you. Like, if there was a bigger benefit or like a list of projects that we can point at and say, okay, this now unlocks that list of projects, no question in my mind, we should do this, right? But I'm just not quite there. If we're going to do this, I would say option 2, $5. Let's just make it big, right? Or big enough to be meaningful in some way.
Well, the money wise, it's not much different, right? So a little bit different.
$25,000 difference, right, between the two, so.
Well, it depends on how we set the option 2 tier.
Yeah, option 2, we set it at $250 at 24. We set it at $5.48 and anywhere in between.
Honestly, I mean, I think that I mean, I like the simpleness, I guess you could say, about having that option too, but knowing that, if it's easier to defend in general, the option one.
So yeah, option 1 also effectively takes out the need to modify the rate structure in the future. So there's changing the rate, which is the rate for tier 1 is $1.50, 5, 7.50, 10, et cetera. Option 2 leaves it open to potentially having to change that rate structure in the future as well.
Is it changing the actual value kind of rate structure change or just?
No, that's just a rate change, which is going to happen at some point. And it will for as long as this fund exists.
No, sorry, I mean, changing the ERU, like if we average all the year, we find, oh, actually it should be 50 square feet more to build a bigger homes or something. Is that,
I've never heard of a town doing that.
oh, you just,
Yeah, that would effectively change the rate structure. It would change where homes fall.
It would be a rate reduction eventually.
Yeah.
So Councilman Zager, we're waiting. Have a decision.
The option.
I'm strongly one, to capture that tail. There's a long tail, impervious. If you look at the table, I studied the table and I was like, God, this is such a long tail, very large impervious area thing. So I think the option 1, capturing that is what I'm interested in. And the revenue admittedly is not very much. I mean, we're talking about millions of dollars here usually, and this is very small, but the fact that it's an every year thing ongoing is why I think it's worth discussing this at all, because, you know, $25,000 a year, 1 year, who cares? Like every single year, it adds up over time and can allow for projects to be small things. Yeah, I kind of want to know, like, are there like 1,000 small projects that could have more impact than like some big ones that we have? I'm kind of interested. There'd be a lot of value in this more if there's like a ton of small things that like could cumulatively do a lot of good.
Unfortunately, I can't answer that because stormwater is why, depends on where it's raining, right? I mean, if it rains really hard on this side of the street, not raining over here, it looks terrible. I mean, I had this past weekend, literally the most flooding or most rain in my backyard I've had, and I've been there 20-some years. Now, that probably wasn't the experience of everyone living in Apex, but that was my experience at my house for that event at that time.
I'll add, our system assessment is going to allow us to begin an asset management program, and that asset management program combined with the capital improvement plan will allow us to rank those projects.
Yeah.
So once you get into that ranking, it doesn't necessarily matter the size of the project because there are going to be other components that tell us the relative priority of that project. And if we can fund those higher priority projects, we're going to have the largest impact.
And one quick, wait, can you go back to the slide with the different dollar amounts change? Yeah. If you think about it from a political point of view, we're gonna, let's say there'll be a medium pushback to any fee increase, and in that case, there's gonna be a medium pushback from 1,000 people, 1,000 homeowners here. I think if you do the tiering thing with the tail, nobody's gonna care if you increase it by 5 cents, but
that's not my perception.
there's gonna be a strong pushback from the 10+ people in this. It's only 35 of them versus 1,000.
I don't know about that. I don't think the pushback will be proportional to how much you pay more. I think what's going to happen is I would rather raise rates in 3 different ways than in 4 different ways. It doesn't matter if the fourth way is $1 or $10 million. Like there's a narrative about how the budget's structured and what we're doing holistically, that having another increase in a different way, it's another part of another argument. So I think you'll get pushback, not from those people. I think you'll get pushback from people who are already predisposed to push back, and this will just be another point that they'll make. Oh, you did this. Why'd you do it? What are you gonna say when they ask you why you did it?
I think
We'll
that,
be asked the question. Like I think it's.
I do think that this your point and your point as well is adding to the larger conversation about how do we tell people about this? Because I still think that even though we explain to folks what our stormwater utility fund would be, I think the vast majority of people don't remember that. It's kind of like at Big Fest this weekend, a woman came up to us and she showed us her backyard. It had a culvert that was flooding, lots of water. I had to explain to her, I said, that means it's working. That water's not in your house. That's a good thing. Once she heard that, she was like, oh, okay, that makes sense. So it's much more of an education on a continual basis sort of thing. And I think that, the money that we're getting out of this to help kind of fund that education, I think is something that can give us bigger dividends down the road, because it isn't the increase. We're always going to get people complaining about the increase, and we're always going to have people complaining about the stormwater. It's just a question of how well are we explaining why this is there, why this is the bigger picture.
Thank you, Councilman. Mr. Kirk, great presentation. We're at 3, option 1, so I think we have majority.
Sorry, did you say it? Was it
Option
three,
one.
option one?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. Any other questions, discussion? All right, thank you so much.
Appreciate the time.
All right, thank you.
All council questions come to me because it's my idea. So you guys, angrygrams.
That's not how we do things, Brett. Don't worry about it.
I can do that anyway. Okay, yeah, good.
All right, moving on. Thank you all so much. Is that the race discussion?
Yeah.
Great, right.
Yeah, got it.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Craig Brown. I work for 1898 Co., which is, if you're not familiar, is the consulting arm of Burns McDonald. I've worked with Town of Apex for a couple of years now. Worked on the rate study last year. Was here about a month ago, kind of speeding up this process with the finance committee, and working with Amanda, Target, and staff quite a few months on this. We're going to talk today about rate making for solar and electric vehicles. Just to kind of give a bit what we're going to go through, this is kind of the scope we went through in the project. We're going to talk a little bit about what we did, what your current system does, what your use looks like, a little bit of financial analysis. We went through some financial modeling to kind of extrapolate solar on your system and what that looks like from a financial impact situation. And then we're going to talk about different rate design options for addressing and incorporating solar EVs on your system. We'll talk about solar rates, and we'll talk about electric vehicle rates from a home charging perspective.
Before you go to Apex stuff,
Yeah.
I know Duke was in the news recently for some votes that were had about along these lines. Can you give a quick background about what they're doing versus this, and like, does what they do affect us at all?
I have a slide on that. I think basically
Okay.
what Duke is changing to is they're changing their net metering program just from a flat rate like we do now to a time of use based rate. That's actually one of the options going to be for you.
Okay,
But to my knowledge, that's the change they're talking about.
and that's passed and is going to be in practice and in some.
I think so. It's not clear how it's, from the information I looked at, it's not clear how it's going to be implemented yet.
Okay.
It's still a little bit details being worked out. I think it's going to be till 2027 and transitions it. Okay, so this starts with a slide of what your growth in residential solar installation is on your, okay, that's actually grown since I was here a month ago. The slide a month ago was through December, and I believe the number was 575 solar installations. It's now 806. So the growth trend continues to go up. We don't have the installed capacity for the entire population. We had a sample of it, and we just wanted to draw some statistics to see how your sizing compares to other people in the state. So you're about an 8.5 average kilowatt system. So somewhere in that 7.5 to 8.5 range. The state average is about 6.5, which is the national average. So all that data say is the solar installations that are being installed on residential houses here are larger than most places. 806 is the current amount, and that's kind of where we're gonna scale things today. So how we address this project is we started by generating hourly load profiles for both a residential customer and a customer solar. And we leveraged some data from NREL, which is the National Renewables Energy Laboratory, to get solar profile. There's a bunch of assumptions on it's, you cite it in Apex, it factors in the weather, you put it in like a fixed tilt. There's a bunch of assumptions that go behind it. But we basically tried to come up with the most appropriate sample of a solar profile that would be for this town. And then we pulled a typical residential customer profile from ResStock, I believe it was. And it basically tells this is what a typical non-solar customer looks like on an hourly basis. And when you get the hourly year long, so it's like we have 80,760 entries for each hour a year. Those solar profiles will actually model things like weather, things like that. So we'll have some of the days will be cloudy, you won't get as much output, things like that. From there, we did a little bit of financial modeling to see what your current rate structure recovers on a per customer basis, if you're over or under recovering. And then we kind of extrapolate that out to, what it is on the whole system. With the solar customers, we also tried to look at what the power supply costs are. So looking at those hourly data when peaks happen gives the ability to understand how much they're impacting and reducing the system's peak by having their solar running during the CP period. And then at the end, we basically extrapolated out to say, okay, here's where we are today. What happens in the future? What if 10% of the city has solar, 20%, and then probably an unrealistic scenario, what if 50% of the houses in the city have solar? So this is basically just kind of a snapshot of what the output of that 8.5 kilowatt system would look like. So you can kind of see the months across the top, the average of the day. It peaks around noon, and as you get to the tails, later in the day, the basically it kind of just dwindles down. So a lot of your peaks we'll see are in the winter, in the 8 a.m. range. The afternoon is 4 o'clock range. So sometimes there's actually a pretty strong contribution to your peaks. In the winter, there tends to be less. So this was just going to show you the detail for time's sake. I'll just get past this. Kind of shows how we did the hourly. This shows the hourly profile for each month on average. And the vertical bars are the time of the system peak. So if you see only one bar, that means the last 5 years, it's been the same time every month of that 5-year period. And if you see multiple, you can see, but
What are the bars?
so that's the time of the system peak. Like you can see 8 a.m. in January, each of the last 5 years, the coincident peak's been at 8. And remember, your CP is set not necessarily when your system peaks, but when Duke's system peaks. That's what sets the Nekempa demand charge. And that's the biggest driver of your power supply cost.
Is it about the same normally, Duke's versus ours?
It actually doesn't matter what yours are, because with your Nekempa cost, because you're effectively a wholesale customer of Duke, that's how the electricity to Nekempa relationship works. It matters when Duke's system peaks.
Can you let them know, make sure everybody understands how our bill's made up and those costs?
Yeah, so,
That's a key to understand.
We understand the concept of demand charges and energy charges. I think you know that for your industrial customers, a demand charge is set based on the maximum kilowatt load in a period. It can be the peak load at any time during the month. That's kind of called non-coincident peak. Or it can be whatever your load is at some other peak. And in your case, it's whatever the Duke system peaks, whatever your load is at that hour, that sets your demand charge for the month. Your demand charge is, it's going down actually to $21 and change a month. Think about your industrial rates or your commercial rates, that's only like a $10 demand charge. So for a municipal power, it's a very high demand charge. And then the energy charge is only 2.5 cents. I think it's going up to 2.6 cents this next year. So it's almost like a very high fixed charge, very low variable cost, because the energy cost is only 2.689 cents. So what this shows is
You say $20 or 20 cents?
$20 per kilowatt is the demand charge.
2.6 cents.
2.6 cents per
that-
kilowatt hour. That's like a typical energy. So like your residential customer is 9.4 cents a kilowatt hour. The Nekemba Energy portion of that's 2.7 cents.
Yeah.
But the demand charge makes up a lot bigger portion of your power supply cost.
Sounds like it's 99% of our bill.
It's more like 75. So it's a huge driver, and it's especially going to be impactful when we talk about EV chargers later, but especially with solar too, because your job should get people to get off that peak. And that's why with time as use rates, you kind of hone in on some of that and set it to where you're setting a cost, like an economic price signal in those periods to use less energy. And then that's where we're going to go with a lot of this.
So we wish this bar was in the middle of that.
Yeah, so yes,
Sure,
in an ideal scenario, you would have your peak at noon when all the solar's running, and it would be great, but then that would change your load curve. So then you wouldn't be, then you'd be peaking some other time. So we went through a sample of, I think it's 600 net meter customers on the residential side. And we're trying to figure out, and you have a wide range, because you have some, what I would call McMansions that have solar that barely impacts their load. Like they're still thousands of kilowatt hours per month. And you have some that are way overbuilt for their system and are exporting every month and are negative every month. So I'm like, all right, let's look at averages and medians and try to make this not too complicated. So we kind of pulled the median, and that is 191 kilowatt hours per year. So, and then a typical residential customer is 10,500. And so that's, a little under 1,000 kilowatt hours a month typically. The median net metering customer for you is a little above break. And there's quite a few that look like a normal residential customer. There's quite a few that are negative for the year. So, what are they contributing right now from a revenue perspective? If you look at your energy charge of 9.4 cents per kilowatt hour, that's this amount. You have a $25 a month customer charge that generates $300. And so a typical residential customer is going to contribute about $1,300 a year. Net metering is about $318. This also factors in, assumes that customer is positive in every month. I believe the way you're currently billing net metering customers, if their usage is negative, it actually erodes that $300 from the customer charge as well. So that there's that point as well. But I did want to point out here that it's not just the revenue. They're obviously reducing their power supply costs as well, which is a big piece of that. And so my goal was to get to what's the apex cost with that. So you can see that in some months, based on our modeling, these solar customers are actually exporting to the grid during the peak. And they should be computed. That's just bringing down the system load. So we've captured that in the analysis. That's actually offsetting their cost. So that brings down the cost side as well. So if we put this side by side, you can see here's the revenue we had before, subtract off the power supply. This is where we get into the conversation of how is this impacting our system? Because the power supply cost is just the Nekemba piece. It's basically a pass-through. You all budget for everything else in the budget, which is owning and operating the distribution system, customer service, cost of staff. It's this below power supply line. That's the apex budget. That's what you control. That's what you're here to operate. So a typical residential customer contributes $575 per year. Net meter customer, the difference from revenue minus their power supply cost, 120. So you're only getting about 21% of the apex, contribution to apex costs for net meter customer as you are a regular residential. So you're effectively, I don't know about losing. You're effectively losing $455 per customer for each net meter customer, and that's going to grow obviously with time. So what's the impact now? So currently, if you take that $455 and take that times 806 solar customers, this is costing you about $367,000 now. As you get to 10%, that value is over $1 million, and so on and so forth. I don't think the 50% is very realistic. I think the 20% is quite possible in this town, just based on how developers are approaching it, how you've embraced it. So that is roughly getting up to close to a $2 million loss per year, just by that subsidy that's going back and forth. This is actually kind of a restate. This kind of shows the graph of the declining revenue as you're getting it. And it shows it on a total revenue basis. You've got about 31 million in residential revenue now. At 20%, that would drop down to low 28 million. Your contribution to costs drops by that 2 million as well. This is all the incremental. So, but you ask kind of like, what's the impact today? About 367,000.
That 455 scales like linearly.
And this is where it scales based on the profile that's installing. If you have more people that are putting small units on monster houses, that number will be lower. If you have more people that are oversizing their system for their load, that number can get way worse.
Okay.
And that's the trend that we're seeing. Is that
Okay.
What was that?
We're seeing oversizing.
Oversizer. Okay.
Yeah, and I think Craig showed that on one of our committee meetings, like the average, I think the average is like 6 something. What's the average?
Yeah, that was one of the early ones.
Oh, yeah, sorry.
I think the average is like 8.5 in your system, and the average for the state 6.61. So, we talked about this in finance committee. This is very much developer driven, because developers, people that sell solar systems, they know where they can make the economics work best. It works better in Apex than any other part of probably North Carolina, just because you have a very generous net metering policy. And so it makes sense it's easier to sell to residential customers here. I think this is generally a more fluid place for people to afford to put solar on. So it's not surprising to me that you're getting these kind of results. But yes, I would say if people continue to oversize and have that negative export or more export than import, that number actually is going to be larger, and you're going to lose more per customer.
Because the return on investment time frame is shorter for the customer.
And it also becomes, this is where the self-fulfilling prophecy or utility death spiral, the more this happens, the more you have to raise residential rates. The higher residential rates get, it makes the economics of solar better. And then I think you know that's all right. Any questions on that before we talk about great options on ways you can address this equitably and still be able to support solar customers? So just a quick refresher for anyone that wasn't here last year on the rates presentation. There's 2 concepts in general about, there's 3, I don't like the third. There's net energy metering and net billing. Net metering is what you do now. But there's basically one meter that it just goes forward and backwards. If you're taking energy from the grid, it's spinning forward and generating what you are. If you're exporting more than you're using, it goes back onto the grid. And whatever the net amount is what you're using or what you're billed for. Net billing basically bifurcates that and keeps separately tracks what you're using from the grid and what you're putting back on the grid. And in both systems, you get to use whatever you're generating. If you have whatever your load is when you're generating, it's used. But with net billing, you can have separate charges for what you pull from the grid, and that's usually just charged at the regular rate. Then you can have a rate that gets credited for that's different on what actually gets exported back to the grid. That's kind of lays the groundwork for the 2 options we're going to look at. Okay, I'm going to go through this pretty briefly, but I don't have a ton of time. So one way you can do that is we talked about, there's power supply costs, that's your New Campbell bill, there's distribution costs, and there's customer costs. You all made a great step last year, and by increasing your customer charge to $25, and that captures basically full customer costs and probably a little bit of distribution as well. But I think that is very helpful. If you wanted a true no subsidy way to do it, you could put all of the distribution costs as well in a fixed fee. But I don't think that's a very realistic thing, since distribution costs generally change with peak. And that would, based on your costs, would increase the customer charges to about $44 a month instead of $25. I don't think that's a realistic option for you. And that would increase. We kind of, a lot of these next few slides are going to have a sample with all these rates are just demonstrative. They're not the exact ones we do, but just kind of want to show the scale. But I'm showing it with a typical residential customer with a negative 100, so a net export to the grid of 100 kilowatt hours. So that would be at your current rate at $15. The other way to do that, instead of having a fixed charge for distribution costs, is having either an NCP or a CP demand charge. You can have just a demand charge for the distribution piece, or you could have a demand charge for the distribution and the coincident peak with the power supply. This is going to give you, more cost. This is probably aligns the best with cost causation. It's going to give you a more consistent revenue stream. It's definitely the most equitable. But depending, like if you're on distribution only for the demand charge, it may not recover all the CP costs, and a couple different ways you can look at it. The top one would be just if you're doing a demand charge for the distribution facilities and you're still doing net metering on the power supply. And that increases a little bit. If you did a full, this example is if you did a full CP only charge, but they're still getting the net, but if they can be off peak and not be taken during that peak period, it can be, this is where it can swing wildly above or below. So depending on how they use or export during the CP, this could have wild swings on people's bills. This is where we start getting to what I think is more realistic, and that's having net metering with time of use energy charges. Now, in reality, your costs don't change on an hourly basis. But you can design time of use rates to have the period most likely to have that CP in. And that's what you want to do. Whenever we've looked at we know what times historically those come in. We can narrow it down to the 4-hour window. And if you put all the demand costs of that CP in an on-peak energy charge, then that's going to send the right economic signal that it costs way more to work at these hours a day. It's probably around 3 to 7 in the summer and 6 a.m. to 10 a.m. in the winter. And then there's some shoulder periods in there that shuts down to work on.
Sorry, can you like NCP and CP?
Sure. Non-coincident peak is the peak whenever, regardless of when the system peaks. So whatever the individual customer's peak is for the month, that's non-coincident peak. And that's when we talk about rates for distribution facilities, like all the lines within your system, those are sized to meet non-coincident peak load. So they have to be built in size, the maximum load they'll ever serve. So you can't it doesn't change. Once you build it, doesn't matter how many kilowatt hours go. And so it becomes more disparate as you go closer to the customers. CP is coincident peak. That's whatever any customer's peak is at that time of the due peak in your case. So what you would do for Apex, you would have a window of on-peak hours that captures the cost of that system peak. And you honestly may not be too far off with your current rate structures of 19.5 on peak and 5 off peak. I think we lowered this on my suggestion last year because I think it was 27. I think it was probably not attracting customers. I think the on peak was probably too scary, if you will. But depending on how a customer, whether they're importing or exporting, you can see relative to the $15, if they're using power during the on-peak period and exporting during the on-peak period, their bill will go up a bit. Now, if they're exporting during the on-peak hours and taking load during the on-peak hours, their bill will even be lower than what it is today. So it's syncing up the cost causation and the system benefits with the charges. So with net metering and time of use, you actually get the credits sync up. You can only offset on-peak use with on-peak credits, and your off-peak load can only be offset by off-peak exports. So the impact on customers could vary, but it syncs up with what the benefits are of the system.
I'm trying to imagine this in real life. Like if a solar customer really, if this was in place, I mean, the best case for Apex is that the solar customer has their panels pointed toward the sun in the morning in the winter.
Yeah.
And in the evening, trying to capture that last little bit in the summer. And I know they don't move, I guess they could move on a house if you design it that way. So it would try to incentivize that, because that would lower the cost for everybody, because the peak would be, they'd be generating the most during the peak.
Yes.
Which would
And
be good.
there's a difference. There's strategies. You can either maximize kilowatt hour generated, or you can maximize the peak capacity that's generated. If you want to maximize the capacity and not the energy, point west, not south. Because the sun, it's catching that sun longer.
Yeah.
So, but and also the point of this is that I think is appropriate for you is this doesn't have to be just for solar customers. I would recommend this for transitioning all your residential customers to this. So everyone's in the same boat.
Yeah, everyone, if you're trying to get,
That's kind of my goal. Just,
everyone turns their stuff off at the peak, that's
Yeah.
the best for all of us.
Yeah.
Which is why the load thing happens, right? Okay, yeah.
So we are using differentiated rates for on and off peak today.
you have
An
an
option.
option. It's an option that's not very,
Not currently, right?
yes,
No,
it's an opt-in rate.
We got to shut down right now.
but it's going to, right? There's it needs a device, right? It's kind of
Meters.
a meter
Meter.
that's,
Yeah.
we don't have enough of those right now. But that's temporary, right? The meter shortage thing is temporary, a temporary problem, hopefully.
Maybe.
We're transitioning to AMI. That's what I'm just going.
Once we get AMI, we're gonna need those meters because the AMI will be able to.
It's a combination that the system we have in place that reads the meters now is unexpandable. So we don't want to expand that system, only rip it out. So the system, that system itself, we can't expand it and it doesn't cover certain areas. So we can't selectively tell people down here, you can have it, you can't have it. So we've got to shut down temporarily because we can't universally do it across the entire territory right now. Plus, those meters are hard to get. So we've got a few of them and we're saving those for our commercial customers so that we don't want to.
Yeah.
As
But long term, this should work itself out.
soon as AMI comes, we're done.
So effectively, we have to have single rate. For residential, we have single rates. Okay.
Yeah, currently right now, everything's at 9.5 cents, which means when customers are exporting the grid, they're basically being paid 9.4 cents.
Yeah, and just to tell you, I think if we were looking at the system, I think we've only got a handful of people that volunteer on use. I mean, literally a handful. So it's not a popular rate regardless, even though we have it. Only because the rate, and I think they're set up pretty good to drive behaviors, but nobody wants to drive
The transitioning time and use is scary.
Like I didn't even really look like, I'm an electric customer. I didn't even know that option exists, right? So I think there's an education component here too.
That's the last billing, that's the last net metering. So net billing, as we talked about, that's where you have basically a separate rate for what you take. So you pay the standard rate for what you take. You can pay a separate rate for what you export back to the grid. It's basically just the town buying it back at a different rate. For anyone that was here last, we went through this in the rates presentation last year, but this talks about the different components of cost that we basically develop a value of solar rate that to kind of guide the setting of what you're going to pay for that value that you put back in the grid. So avoided energy generation, transmission, cost of integrating solar. There's the environmental attributes, the value of a REC that's usually added in, and other environmental considerations. We just randomly say, we like this, we want to raise, we don't get tight enough, so we're going to raise it up above what it says. It's perfectly fine. So net billing, I believe, is one of the most equitable ways to do it. Because you're determining what the value of that solar is as a council, but it's also not overcompensating by getting the full retail rate. Like I do think it's fair. You have control over what that rate is, but it is likely that customers will be compensated less than they are today. A lot of people have built their systems based on the current compensation. So just a sample of what this may look like. Say you're of that -100, you're pulling 100 from the grid, but exporting at a lower rate of 5.5 cents. The bill would go up about $8 compared to the way it is today. And obviously this would flip depending on the situation and how much you're importing versus exporting. So net billing with TOU rates, this is kind of like, you actually have this already. This is kind of like your bilateral rate, where you have a time of use rate, and you also have separate rates for buyback. So this effectively works kind of like you have already. I believe this is the one that's closed, but there's no one on it anymore, I believe. Or very few. So I think you want to get away from the here's the Duke Energy net metering policy slide. So yeah, so we go flat credit to a time of use credit for solar net metering. Talks about the docket, but yeah, it won't take place until 2027, and they're still waiting details on how the time of use rate's getting structured. So that's the time we pulled this together. It's still in the works.
Is this cost structure that we have with the peak being much, much higher than the regular, is that reflective of kind of how much it costs Duke to produce energy?
It is, yeah. So it's basically, and you pay the same rate as all their wholesale customers. It's not like they have a specific PA agreement. You know, when you, in 2015, when Apex and all the other Nekempa members sold the generation assets that Nekempa owned or Electric City owned to Duke, that the agreement was to, you know, it paid off most of the debt with what you got from that, but you effectively became charged like a wholesale customer. So yeah, it is a formula rate. Gets updated every year. It's run through the PSC, and it's well documented. So yes, it's when you get to power side, it's a very high fixed cost demand, and you've got assets in there like nuclear, things that are super high capital cost and low variable energy cost. The system's thriving.
And a lot of it because they have to build facilities that have to turn on like at 3 o'clock,
Yeah.
and that's really what the problem is here.
It's that, and it also as I think everyone has the goal of getting more renewable energy on the system, but you still have to have that firming load when it's off. And so it's almost like you need more capacity to serve the same load as a part of the transition to greener power.
Okay.
But it's not necessarily unique to you. I also do work for a utility that has a very similar power agency in Kentucky. I think their demand charge is like $18 instead of $21. It's very similar, very low energy charge. Okay. This is my recommendations of the options we've talked about here, and for future discussion. Net billing remains the most cost-based and equitable option. I don't think that's the direction you're going to go. So assuming net metering stays in place, doing something with CP rates is by far the most equitable because it's a direct leverage, but I don't think you're going to put a $20 customer charge on your residential class. We know that. So with that being said, I think time of use is the most realistic option for the town's environmental goals. It's going to sync up what you're doing with when customers are importing or exporting to the grid and compensate them more in direct alignment with that. I think that's going to allow you to continue to allow solar. But the key has to be covering that peak demand cost of your power supply. This is a recommendation we actually haven't really discussed yet. I think the minimum bill each month should be the customer charge. I don't think you should be able to reduce your usage below and erode that $25. If your net exports are so high that it rates, all the energy, then they can roll over to the next month, and maybe somewhere down the road you're using more or exporting less, and they offset by the end of the year. But if you're setting a $25 customer charge because that's the fixed cost of operating the system, in my opinion, that should be the minimum rate as well. Like I said, the time of use option will allow people that export during on-peak times to be compensated. So instead of being paid 9 cents right now, they'll be getting paid 20-some cents, probably, or whatever, 19 cents for what they're exporting during peak times. And that's going to benefit the whole system by them generating during that CP hour. And I don't think this is something that could happen either way with anything we do. There's always going to be opportunities for someone to game the system with batteries, and this is coming. But with the time of use option or any option, you can have people that will charge their battery off peak and exporting back on peak. So they're paying 5 cents for it and exporting back at 19 cents. So,
But
there's
they're
not
reducing
what you can
the
do
usage.
about that.
Yeah, is it a bad thing?
So that's good.
That's from a, it is, but it's a revenue risk for you. And I think that goes part of the minimum bill being the customer charge as well. So,
But if we just,
I like to say creates a potential for arbitrage.
yeah,
of
exactly, yeah.
Energy usage.
Did what now?
Arbitrage, like the way it's phrased, I think there's, overly negative, sorry.
could you say it will encourage investment in battery storage too? Yeah, it seems like it would, right?
Yeah.
Which is a good thing,
Yes.
right? Our revenue's bad, but like for the world, it's a good thing.
Yes.
So, I'm sorry, still trying to catch on here. So when you say peak hours, you're talking about these hours like the bar lights.
Yes, those bars, that's when you need to,
Right.
we would frame the on-peak periods around those.
And so do you have an overlay of when these bars hit discharge, right? Because if I read this correctly, like our peak hours are when the output from the system are the low.
Those red curve, I mean, lowest are night.
Like,
So the red bars, yeah, the solar output, this is not the system output. Your system output is pretty much in sync with the system's work. So
Yeah.
your peak usage is there as well.
The green is basically the peak and the reds where it goes to zero.
The peak usage,
So this is what, it's like 2 slides back from this one. Right, this is how an 8.5 or 8 kilowatt system produces electricity,
yes,
right? So at 8 o'clock in the morning, right, there's some electricity produced, but not anywhere near like what you see at 12 or 1 o'clock, right?
but at 4, they're still pretty significant. And that's the ones we see those months where they're actually exporting during the peak, and that's great.
So, but if you go to, and these slides are teeny tiny, right? So if you go to the monthly slides, I can't really read when
Yeah,
the
so
peak are here, right? But
I can tell you. So in the mornings, it's almost always 8. There's a couple, that was at 7. Almost usually at 4 o'clock, some at 5, some at 6. This is what those are.
right, so I guess what I'm saying is that the peak hours coincide with the least amount of output on the solar system.
Yes.
right, that's not true. The least amount of output is overnight.
Is night, yeah.
Like
Very good, very good, very good.
the peak hours coincide with maybe on the downslope. Like the peak is gonna be noon.
Yeah.
That's where the sun's in the sky the highest. And the peak usage is like 4 PM. So you're kind of halfway down. So ideally it would be noon, but it's not. It's like,
But they're gonna put the battery in, right? Everybody's gonna start doing the battery thing and they're gonna charge the battery up during the day and then deploy it at.
and in theory, if that works out, that would be really, really good. Like everyone like dumped power on the grid at the peak time. Like they would get more money, but we would also get charged less because it would lower our costs.
It would lower that.
And as long as that revenue you're paying them is in sync with what you're paying, that's a good.
But we still have the fixed cost of all of our distribution, right? And so like whether you're basically net zero or not, right? You still rely on that grid to take and deliver electricity.
And that goes back to kind of
The
the.
$25 will cover all of that?
No, it covers the customer piece. So basically, at this level, that's your contribution to all other costs, your distribution and your customer. The $25 pretty much covers the customer cost. That's the cost of billing, the cost of on-site facilities like the meter, the service drop. Part of the distribution system is customer related as well. So I think all in customer cost is probably 20 a month. You expanded a little bit beyond there to know, because you're calculating that distribution cost as well. I think there's 25 instead of 44, I think would be, if it was all for those costs. Yeah, then this is, and to a point, this is the cost of doing business, if you will, if you want to get more solar on your system. And at what point are you not comfortable with some customers paying more for the distribution system than non-solar customers? And I think moving to something like a time of use would help with that equity, to where it's more in alignment with the cost structure and recovering that CP at least, where you're not losing as much on the power supply side. And you'll just have to see over time how that works with the distribution system.
So then, oh, go ahead.
Maybe I'm not understanding these numbers very correctly, but, you know, my thought on, you know, when we have, even if it's on that downslope, when they're providing some offset, so to speak, to our peak charge, our peak demand charge, is that showing that cost difference there, what they're
So,
adding?
this is too much detail to show on a slide, but when we figured out what's the impact on power supply for the net meter customers, this actually captures that negative amount where they're actually contributing and getting paid for that peak demand almost by lowering the system average. So that factors in here. Well, their power supply costs are much lower, and it does capture the impact of them and that system benefit. So
I know you have more slides to go through. Do you want to like?
Well, can I actually,
this is about,
The next-
the
the next
then we go to
EVs.
the chargers.
do you have that 450 number if we go with, let's say time of use is the only thing we offer, and then we do the minimum bill thing. Do you have that, what that number would be?
I don't, that's kind of like the next step in this process is trying to figure out where it goes based on guidance review, what the impact would be on a certain rate option.
Okay, and how much is like heat pumps, and let's say 50% heat pumps in Apex in 10 years? How would that change this if at all?
Generally, that's very beneficial because it adds winter kilowatt hour sales, so it increases the overall load factor for the system by having it. Again, you got to be careful because heat pumps are going to be kicking on in the mornings when your peaks are. So it's kind of it's good for overall system load factor, but if it's in alignment with your coincident peak, it can be harmful.
Which it probably will be. We'll be switching around here from gas to heat pumps. And but then the
and
numbers
it's
are
fairly mild winters here.
the same because everybody has AC, electric AC. Okay, so it would maybe increase the usage on the peak winter mornings,
Yes.
which would be, yeah.
Which is literally why everyone peaks at 7 or 8 a.m. in the winter, so that everyone gives up.
Hang on, yeah.
Can we go to the next slide? So we have this conversation every year, right? And I think every year, like, you know, there's a pretty big philosophical gap, I feel, between myself and maybe council and maybe people that are in, you know, the power industry about what the purpose here is. And I think one thing that we need to speak about is what the public policy goal is of all of this and what we're trying to do when we encourage solar adoption. So it's been like called a solar subsidy, and I don't really like that term because, again, you know, terminology is important here. But you know, for sake of conversation, I'm willing to call it solar subsidy. It's like, what is a solar subsidy? What's the purpose of it? We're trying to drive solar adoption because we think clean energy is good. So we put in place public policy which encourages people to go out and get solar. Now, it's really important to me that we have. I'm proud of the fact that currently, and provided we don't do anything today, anything unusual today, we have probably the most solar friendly policy in North Carolina that I know of. I think that's important to stay that way. Duke Energy is making some changes. I'd like to be better than Duke Energy. They're making their change in 2027, not in 2024. There's an opportunity here for us to see what happens with them and learn from that, see what the impact is, see what the reaction is, see what the reaction is in terms of solar adoption, what's a good amount. So I'll just throw that out there. So for all the numbers you presented, only the ones that I care about are on this slide. And it's our total revenue, which is the top line, versus the bottom line, which is what the quote unquote subsidy is. Like, what's that ratio? That's what it comes down to. It's like we have this policy in place, which encourages solar adoption. Obviously, it's not free. What is the cost to our residents? What's the percent as a percent of your bill? If solar didn't exist and everyone's on a regular customer, what would the bill be? What are we losing? And I think that's what this slide is. And I've been asking for that for a while. You provided it, so thank you. So the answer is today. It's about 1%, right? So because of solar today, our customer bills are maybe 1% higher than they would otherwise be because it's costing us $367K.
Yes.
Our total revenue is around 31 million. So that's about 1%. So the question that we really need to ask ourselves is what level of subsidy, we're going to call it that, are you comfortable with before we like this is not fair. Is it 1%? Is it 5%? Is it 10%? Clearly, it's not 50%. Clearly it's not 20%. There's some number where it's like, okay, this is too much. We need to make some policy changes to adjust that. And that's, we can all have our own opinions on that. I think 1% is fine. Like 1% is not all that much. If you see solar going up to 10% adoption, what does that look like? About 2.5% total?
Yeah.
Still not that bad, but maybe 2.5% starting to sound like a lot. If solar adoption gets to 20%, we're at a little under 6%, 7%. So now our customer bills are 7% higher than they would be if we have 20% solar adoption. Now you're like, maybe that's a little unfair, we can make some changes. So that's the way I'm framing it. Like, what is the level of solar subsidy? There are people who would say that the correct level of solar subsidy, maybe you feel this way, is $0. There should be complete cost recovery, and there should be no solar subsidy whatsoever. We need to structure it so it's recovered. I don't feel that way. I feel like it's appropriate for us to put in place a policy which drives solar adoption until we get to a point that solar adoption is good enough, or the subsidy is too high that we can no longer take it. We need to dial it back.
So, can I ask a question?
Yeah.
So the 1%, right? So based on today's numbers, right? We're losing about 1% of revenue. Are you suggesting that we're making that up by raising everybody's rate by 1%? So we're basically net zero on the revenue side, or?
Effectively, that's what we're doing, right? Like if we have to, the electric utility has to fund its costs.
Right.
So like if the solar customers are costing us $367K, then that sort of makes sense that everyone else's bills are 1% higher than they could be. Like we could lower the rates 1%. And then if we had complete cost recovery, I think that's what these slides are saying, right?
So I just wanted to kind of get that straight.
With the $25 customer flat fee.
That's not even.
Yes. That's what they're changing from last year, right? Yeah. So, and that's my other point is that we, there's a range of policy options we have. If we believe that the solar subsidy is getting too expensive, there's a whole range of stuff we can do that would turn the dial slightly to kind of get it back to the comfortable range. Like, what is your comfortable range for it?
I just want to clarify that the customer fee that we're charging everybody, we're still giving people credits. Like we're not capturing all of that.
If they're
It's not being captured in this.
Right. So that's my, as you're considering that, are you saying that at a minimum, every customer will get that $25 fee and we will capture all of that, or are you still keeping it the way?
I think where we differ the most is I am okay with paying people to get solar panels. I want them to get solar panels. I want to see the solar adoption in Apex be the point where everyone's like, oh my God, I go into Apex, there's solar panels everywhere. I think that's a good thing. And that's what I want to do. Once that's done, then clearly there's no need to subsidize it anymore. And or if the costs get too much where everyone else's bills are above a certain percent, that, oh, well, this is now unfair to the point where I think we should change it. So what is that point? To me, it's more than 1%. It's less than 10%, probably less than 5%, but it's more than 1% I'm comfortable with your bill subsidizing solar. That's my philosophy. And like we did last year, we have a lot of ways to turn that dial a little bit so it doesn't grow up to be 5% or 10%. Like it is, like we did last year where we increased the base charge, I think time of use that was presented long-term is absolutely the right thing to do. Like, I think there's other policy benefits to that beyond just the economic impact of having a time of use policy that's widely adopted. Like, that's good for people to work to reduce their peak power usage beyond the fact that it saves us money, beyond the fact that it changes the economics of solar panels. I would like to wait until Duke Energy has implemented that before we do it, because I do want to be better than Duke at all points in time for now and forever.
I just got a question. How many electric cities, municipalities that are on that are using this same model? Do we know that?
For like how many time of use rates?
Yeah.
Not many. Clayton wants to ride your coattails, I believe. Greenville, so Clayton, Greenville, the ones I know best. Greenville has 3 options. They are less solar friendly for sure. They have a net billing option. They have a buy all sell all option, and they have a net metering option with a demand charge. So solar developers probably don't like Greenville at all. But they kind of have those. Yeah, actually, they're just adding the net billing option now because the other 2 were, it's more of a moderated equity for them than what they have as an option now.
Can time of use be the only choice? Are we allowed to do that?
That's where we talked about, that's where I think you should go. You should make this a mandatory rate for all residential customers.
Me too.
That way you're not singling out solar customers.
Me too.
Because it's mutually beneficial. And actually, we're gonna stand by it when I get to residential charging. There's a factor in that time use as well.
Yeah.
And then you have to decide, is it mandatory or is it opt out? You can put everyone, but can they say, no, I want to go back to the regular?
Are we allowed to do mandatory?
You're allowed to do the regular. So you
For the
are,
regular.
yes, you are allowed.
But people will kick and scream and say they have reasons that mandatory time use is bad. Like I have this expensive high-powered medical device that has to run in this hour, and you're being unfair to me by forcing me on this time use system, which raises my energy bill by whatever.
So you would have the ability to set the parameters for someone that could opt out.
And
I think this definitely works best if it's one, mandatory, and two, not just solar customers, but everyone.
Me too.
And also because this isn't something you can do this year. But I think teeing it up, once AMI is done, once your meter data management system's done, your billing system's upgraded. Thinking through what you want to do now is the right way to do it. So you can be ready to pull the trigger. Whatever that is, if you want to wait till after it starts, that's fine. But working through this thought process now is appropriate.
And the chart I'm seeing with the curve, if you keep it going, we'll be at 10% like next year, by the end of next year.
you think
To me. Well, a year is this much of
You
the
went up
graph.
50% in 4 months.
Yeah, it's coming real fast.
I think the 575 when I was here a month ago was for December 2022. So that's
Okay, yeah. Especially with the climate bill incentives, it's gonna go really fast.
I wonder what percentage of new customers, like we break that down to new and existing. I know we had this discussion before. I wonder if like our new homes coming online. And also keep in mind, like there's an effective cap on what your solar capacity is, because not every home is oriented where it makes sense or will ever make sense for solar. Like if you don't have good southern roof exposure, you're just not gonna get solar panels.
I mean, the curve's gonna go like this and it's gonna level off, but
Yeah, there's
we're
some
still in
effects,
this part.
there's some, it's not
Yeah, it's like, you know, if you assume that homes are distributed like normally, like maybe 25% of homes would be suitable because 25% of good southern exposure. The economics makes like the production of a non-southern facing solar panel is like what half, 2/3 of what a full one. I forget what the number is, but it cuts it down, which really makes it not viable or less viable. So I guess that's my feedback is I don't want to make any drastic change today. I would like to be informed about what that rate, I mean, that's, so the analysis you did on slide 14 where it showed the estimate, you know, I know you had a formula of the revenue loss. That to me is the key number and tracking what that reaches at, because I want to make policy changes to make sure that doesn't get too out of whack. But I'm not completely crazy, just slightly crazy.
And we can almost like segment that population. Like I said, it was a pool of like 600 customers, and there were some you could tell were huge mansions that had barely any tax impact solar on it, but they were part of the average.
Yeah.
And there were some that export a lot. We could almost like segment that into quartiles to see how many see how those change over time
Right.
and see which ones grow.
Which brings up another point is in terms of other policy changes we can make, if the council believes as a majority that the subsidy is getting too large, like, couldn't we start regulating the size of the panels as well? Like some of the issues people are oversizing them. Like we can make that stop. We could say, okay, you get solar panels, it's really friendly, but it needs to be based on your energy usage. You can only do a 3 kilowatt system or whatever.
I think that's smart, but it's yeah.
So I just bring that up because there's a wide range of policy options, but really simple stuff like increasing that base charge again, because that turns the dial, you know, of what it is, installation policy charges and, you know, encouraging time of use. And I'll say again, like, I do think time of use is a good thing. I worry about changing the deal on people who've already invested in solar panels. Like how do you, and this is something I think Duke is struggling with as well, is like, how do you, someone who made a very large capital investment under a certain policy, it's really tough to change it on them when they've spent $15,000 or $20,000 or whatever. If they're oversizing their system, something huge. That's a question of fairness there.
And that would be my preference before we make any changes, is to look at all of these other policy change options as part of the recommendations of to pick from.
And like, I don't think any of these recommendations were for this year. This is directionally where you're going as a town. I don't think you're right. I don't think you're ready for it from a billing system.
Every year you guys are gonna beat me a little bit until finally I'm like, fine, put on the.
Right, and I mean, I honestly, and I've said this every year this comes up, I don't want to make any changes until AMA comes online and we have those exact numbers to know how much offset we're getting and not estimates.
And that's when it happens.
What's the timeline for that?
Timeline for AMI.
Hopefully we get a contract in May. We've been negotiating since December.
Okay, and so once we have a contract, what does that mean? Like, are we looking at 2
We
years?
don't have, we don't really know a schedule until we get that contract. So, I mean, but here, the first thing that has to happen is they start with our infrastructure, building the infrastructure for the meters to talk to and the articles for, setting up all the meters so that they're Apex specific, all the things that we want to have in our meters. So, I think you would start seeing it phasing into, and then there's a pilot program to make sure everything's working before you jump all in. So it would be a solid year probably before we actually start phasing final customers into this. I would say at least. Wouldn't you, Eric?
Just trying to understand the economics of this. So, that loss, what was it, what does that make up? Where do we make that up? Is that a possibility of raising electric rates? So my
So
point
there's
is,
there's two aspects to this. And on this slide, so you see this is the contribution to your budget here.
Yep.
Like it can go down $2 million. That has to be made up basically with rate increases well above what you would to get back to this level, if that's what you need to run your distribution system. The other aspect we haven't talked about is, if you remember the cost of service study results last year, the residential already needs a much bigger rate increase than the system average, and your large general and the CP are over collecting. So there was a little, I think we froze large general last year and gave 2.6% to residential instead of but it said like 5.5. That's going to continue to get worse, where they're going to, the spread between cost of service and rates, you're going to have to see upwards pressure on the rates themselves to make up that difference.
so the people with fixed incomes that can't continue to sustain these rate increases, while others, people can afford the solar. I mean, I'm not on solar, but it does impact a large amount of residents and where they're located. I think I asked for a map last year where most of the solar customers were in the town, because I think it really carries a big message. So I have to speak on behalf of residents here that can't continue to afford the rate increases with regard to solar and how that applies to it.
Well, I think time of use should be for everybody anyway, and the fact that it helps with this is even better. So
I actually agree. I just think it's impractical just to make everyone go time use. Like that's it requires a lifestyle change that to actually be, to save you money. And if you don't change anything, switching to time use will be a big bill increase for people who don't change, right?
I think it would need to be a gradual switch.
And it also
ramp up
requires, there's a couple things. It requires education, marketing plans going in to educate your customers. Some people also, for the first year after time of use is implemented, you end up paying the maximum of the bill under the current new rate or the old rate. So it gives people a year to change their behaviors. So if you're not changing your behaviors yet, and your bill would have been lower on the original rate plan, you pay the lower amount. But that gives
that's how you
them a
transition
year
thing.
transition.
Is Duke making time to use
visible on the bill?
It's good. Yeah.
That's what we had talked about last year when we had this discussion. That was one of the things that we had talked about, was the ability to pilot so that we could show people, hey, this would be what your rates would be under time of use. This would be what your rates currently are. Here's the variation, to allow for that public education component. And that will really come into play, with the two things that make that feasible, and that's the AMI and the ERP.
Yeah.
But you can also, over time, change the spread between the two rates, right? So like initially you can make the two rates almost identical, right? It's close to the current rate, like 1 standard deviation, or, and then over time kind of increase that people get more.
So
to running their.
It's a behavior thing now.
They mandated time of use 2-3 years ago to everybody. And they set the rates that were, basically wasn't going to drive anybody to do anything. So they broke the seal. So everybody's going, they went through the the chaos that went on there. And now they've been pushing the rates to separate drive behaviors. When they originally went to it, it wasn't going to drive anybody to think about shutting the switch off at any particular time. The rates just weren't. And still, their rates now aren't far enough. There isn't a far enough spread for most people to worry about throwing a load of laundry on peak. You know, you got to get to the point. And our rates, our time to use rates, they're pretty substantial right now. And I'm not saying that's where we should be. I think they're excessive. I mean, ultimately, you know, when I look at, you know, and I guess my hesitation is the way we buy power from Duke, we can exploit that very well. And we can pass that on to the citizens. If we were to have a residential CP rate, customers, we're buying power at 2 cents. We have to sell it for 9 to cover our risk because of the cost associated with that coincident peak. If they can guarantee me they weren't going to be turning anything on during that 1 hour period that Duke had that period, we can drop our rates down to just about nothing. But because of the way we try to recover our rates through the energy sales, which isn't the best way for us because that's not our bill. Our bill is not our energy. We recover it that way, but it's our demand. So if we can sit there and exploit either through time of use or CP to be able to send the signals so that people aren't using energy during that 1 hour period, we can ultimately reduce our energy bill drastically. You know, we do things like right now with the load management switches. That program itself, every time we flip the switch, saving $200,000 off our energy bill. Just from that one effort alone, which is reducing the energy just through our air conditioning units, heat pumps. But if we can figure a way to drive people to do the right thing, that's great. The problem is we're playing a game trying to recover our energy costs through a variable that isn't related to how we're getting billed. And now we have technologies like EV chargers and solar that are messing with the way we used to recover that. And it's having dramatic effects on our energy costs. And that's where we're having the problem here. So, you know, all this tapering around and, you know, throwing these numbers, you know, as these technologies, when we get to the chargers, you know, we talked about that $25 customer charge. If the customer charges and plugs in his EV charger during that CPP, it's instantly $120 that we have to pay Duke Energy just to plug it in there. We're never going to get that back with $25. And the energy sales we get off of that charging up is $3. By the time he charges that car up, I mean, it's nothing. We're not going to make it through the energy sale to recover that $120 charge for him plugging that thing in. That's if he's got one car. He's got two. We get down the road and everybody's got an EV. We can't be charging during that peak. There's no way we're going to make money. We'll be broke instantly. We won't be able to pay our power bill.
So I have a question. Do we have someone who is playing around with these numbers so that we can recover more accurately those charges based on whatever novel model we choose to do so? I mean, we have the opportunity to play around with this. So have we had someone that has experimented with that to try to see how we can best recover that?
Okay. Yeah, I mean, and this is kind of like the option to do it. Like I said, the most to do what Eric's talking about, that's having a demand charge of $20 for your residential customers for that, but not for their peak, for just that 1 hour. So it's different. Like when you do time of use where you've got a 4 hour window, you have to time that window right, and there's risk there.
That's right.
If it's just a CP rate, they only have to drop that 1 hour
to a whole lot, and that becomes the problem when we're playing around. Unfortunately, we're stuck with that Duke Energy peak that we don't know about until the month closes.
Mm-hmm. So I was going to ask you that. How much advance notice do you get on when it's coming? Because I know like Greenville they've got a ton of like grocery stores with generators. When they know the peak's coming, they kick those on and drops their system demand.
We estimate usually in the morning we'll have a good idea. We'll put them on the morning, and then an hour or two before we think it's going to hit, we trigger it.
Okay. But it could be multiple days. So it's not just. I wasn't sure how much Duke communicates with this as well.
So who are we putting on morning?
That's statement.
Yeah.
Customers that have generators that they can throw on, our large CP customers, basically all our CP customers are exploiting the rate for us. They go out there and they'll flip on their generators. But the other thing is Electricity sends a signal out to all our switches, our load control switches. And that's what drops most of our load. And we do a voltage reduction on our system as well, which is really a great way to cut our energy costs as well. But, and again, that's another discussion we haven't gotten into. We got to redo our whole entire load management program because right now it's written, we mandate they put the switch on the house, we give it to them. We don't mandate they participate. The other thing I would like to do is either mandate participation or charge them at a different rate because they're not helping reduce the overall energy bill to the entire town. So if they decide, and we get a lot of people, as soon as the heat starts, the old heat pumps, first thing, HVAC contractor comes in here, it's got an old system. They say it's because you got that switch on there. The first thing they do is they call us up and they bounce off the system. They say, we don't want it. 2 months later, they finally changed their AC system because it's just not working anymore. But we never get them back on. What we'd like to do, and especially when we get AMI, we'll be able to see that they participate.
Yeah.
And if they don't participate, we're charging them 9 cents now. You can get off the system, you're gonna charge 12 cents. That's fine. You don't want to participate. You're not contributing to the overall reduction of the town by not participating. And really, it has no effect on them. It doesn't inconvenience them with these switches. I mean, we run it so they don't even notice it. If you got a healthy AC system and we're running load management, you're not gonna know it. If you got an unhealthy AC system and we're running load management, you'll probably know.
I mean, it doesn't turn off, it still runs, just,
No, it shuts it off for, it cycles it.
okay.
But yeah,
15 minutes.
you're 100% correct because that happened to me where like I had an AC unit die and the contractor said, well, you know, you're on this little management thing and it's killing it. And that power surge from killing, starting to back up. So it killed your system. So.
And all it does, it doesn't shut this, it basically it's your thermostat, it just opens the thermostat wire. It's just like your thermostat. The thermostat runs in there, we just open the thermostat and says, okay. So it's safely shut. It's not like it's got a contactor in there and it's slamming the system.
But the heat pumps, which are gonna be everywhere pretty soon, those can handle that even easier. That disruption, because they're kind of meant for that.
It was a heat pump. I mean, it's still.
It was a heat pump that messed up?
It wasn't actually messed up. It's just the thing contractors say when heat pumps die. To sell you another one.
Oh, so you have a heat pump, okay.
Yes, I mean, for cooling, yeah.
What's the next step?
So then we go to EV chargers next.
Yeah. I actually had some questions about EV chargers related to the load management system. Like, it feels like that's really an area where we could, with an aggressive policy or incentives, we can get people to not charge during the peak hour. Like, that seems to be important, right?
Yeah, so basically all the conversations we had about peak demand and CP, way more impactful now that we talk about chargers, especially on public chargers. So our first option is for residential, and I'm going to move through this fairly quickly because I think the option for you is a flat dock. So you can do different ways. You can do time of use. You can have summer, winter. You can have shoulder periods. You can have multiple periods during the day. Typical like what you have now is just on-peak and off-peak, summer and winter. My recommendation for a 3-part for you that we already talked about on-peak, off-peak for equitable compensation for solar customers. My suggestion now is that it's super off-peak overnight that drops that rate down closer to what the Nakemba rate is, say 3 cents, and encourage EV owners to charge at night. Pretty much most people that own EVs charge at home. They don't use public chargers. And you have to send them a signal that says, don't come home and plug in your charger. Because that's what kills you. They come in at 5, you're hitting that peak on Duke, and they're adding to it. So if you offer them an option that says, hey, these things are programmable. You can plug it in and it won't kick on until whenever you set it to. If you had a super cheap rate from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. or midnight to 6 a.m., that's going to, it's going to add more EVs to your system because that's setting a right bill. I think that meets your goals. It's going to get them off your peak if people follow the economic incentive. And I think this is a really good option for you. So that would look like, and this kind of shows the impact of here's say a 1,500 kilowatt an hour month customer, they're charging, they're paying 166. If they charge off peak, their bill's $25 lower. If they just come up and plug in and charge on peak, their bill's $30 higher. So it becomes an economic signal to them. It's going to make a, $60 difference per month if they just program their EV to charge when it's cheapest. And that's going to benefit everyone in the system by getting off that CP.
Will we have an idea as to who had an EV charger once we have our magic new system?
Only with AMI.
Yeah, yes, once we have AMI, will there be?
And that's still, you almost need algorithms to detect it. Yes, someone can look through every individual one and you'll see patterns. But there's not like a big blinking light that says even here.
Just based on power use, right? That's
Yeah,
what
so
it is,
you can see changes
like,
inside.
Surges and then drop off.
They
Like,
plug
yeah,
in.
it goes from
It's like-
nothing to really high and then after.
It is, yeah, it's like a lot of chargeables, even just a regular 240 dryer plug, that's like a typical level 2 at home, will go up to 5 kilowatts. Whatever your typical.
There's typically patterns. What we would do is we get with the data analysts and extract data and just have them look for patterns. And the patterns are pretty consistent. You can start to go in there. We can just have that algorithm run through the data and just look for those patterns. And thumbs up that, we're seeing.
So remind me, this is a hypothetical 3-part. What are we at, where we're at night? What are we at today with the 2-part time of use that no one is using?
I compared it just to the flat rate since no one's using it, so, and these are all just hypothetical numbers anyways. So.
Well, I mean, like, how does this compare to actually today? I'm just trying to get like an idea of what the span, what the delta is between on office.
I forget what's your hour, right?
I think we're earlier.
I think what you can do is you can shorten the period. I think they're longer now. And I think since, looking at that 5-year history, I think you have a pretty idea when that Duke CP is coming within a 4-hour window. So I think you could shrink and have more off-peak hours. But that might change the rate for on-peak and make the differential higher.
I think the important thing
More
is,
cost in a short period of time.
I think the important thing is to actually like show people the comparison, like we talked about last year. Like people have to know over a period of time. Like no one's gonna get the message. You can send them a flyer. We actually have to call people, like the guys who are charging on peak and have the super, get a couple guys to like.
There's a lot of like web portal type stuff out there. You could set up on your web, like your town website.
Yeah.
It shows comparisons if you make changes, things like that.
Well, I think once we have the super new AMI system, you can imagine we can pull a report of here are the top 500 customers in Apex who are contributing most to the on-peak usage. And we're not just gonna send them a flyer, we're gonna call them and say, hey, if you change your lifestyle and you go this thing, your usage, your bill will go down by $50. All you have to do is not, I don't know whether you're charging an EV, whether you're running your dryer at 5 p.m., whatever you're doing, do nothing from 4 to 5 p.m. Go with this, let's make this change, and your bill will just drop, nothing else except charging overnight. Like, I think it might require more affirmative or, more engaging outreach than a flyer, because people don't read stuff that gets mailed to them anymore.
The data capabilities of the AMI system is what we tell everybody is the power in it, being able to make those. We can do extracts and look at those customers and figure out what do we need to do to educate them, use them to help do things differently, work with them to say, hey, what's going on in your business that's causing you to have this large bill, and say, hey, you got based on our race, we can do all that stuff. But it requires the data. We don't have it right now, but we know those systems. And the other thing is most of these MDM systems that they have up front have the tools where you can put people, they can do the rate analysis right there on their screen. They'll pull it up and they can play around and they can, they'll be able to, evaluate different rate structures if we have them.
And I think that's good going forward. Just for existing customers, I'm not counting on a significant portion of them going on a website.
Lots.
Like it requires more direct outreach.
But I find that the people that drive EVs are the more likely to change their behavior because of something like this.
That's what I'm hoping.
They're like, oh, I can save everyone money by shifting this. Okay.
But I think a pilot program where it's completely optional, if we don't make it required yet, and we tell them for the first 6 months, we will charge you the lowest of the rates. Like if you sign up for it going forward, we'll charge you the lowest of the rates. And then after 6 months, if you call up and you cancel, it'll be like the old Columbia CD Club. Then we'll keep you on the time of use. We'll charge time of use going forward. But you can still call up and cancel.
That's the opt-out option, right? We're talking about here.
Yeah.
If you're talking a pilot start, yeah, that's a great.
Well, I'm trying, a way to get
You're gonna
people
transition
sort
to
of-
pilot. I think the other options for EVs are similar to what we've talked about. You obviously have a coincident peak rate where, you know, just for that CP hour, whatever it is, if you're charging during that, it's gonna pull your bill up. If you're dropping your load, you just have the domestic house load at the time of the CP, it's way lower than it would have been today. So, this is almost more cost based than the time of use, just because it's so targeted on what your cost is. But it's harder to train and educate customers on this plan because they never know when it's coming. Whereas the time of use period is set and they can change their behavior. So this is drawing that line of like what's truly cost based. Well, what's truly cost based usually is real estate.
I agree this makes sense and it's the most closest analog to what actually happens, but I don't think people are ever gonna completely understand this. Like, it just doesn't, it's complicated,
Yeah,
right?
I
Like demand charge and the hours, if you're gonna look at a calendar, like, you know,
And like Eric said, they don't even know it's coming. You know, so.
well, even just the concept of how it works, I
Yeah.
think is really complicated. Like, it's weird.
Another thing we've done other places that in this, if you're going mandatory time of use, this isn't an option. But if you have people that are averse to going to time of use for their whole house, you can do separately metered EV chargers that are time of use based. So if someone wants to, they don't want to go all in, but and some maybe you can mandate this, an EV charger would be at a time of use so they can get the benefit of doing off peak and avoid the higher cost of being on peak. So
What would be the benefit of having a separate meter versus a load management system on charger?
that load management works great. That's actually one of the options. It gives the customer more control. They don't have to expose their entire house to time of use. And they can control just the EV charger. Load control, then that's gonna vary from time to time, let it be, and that puts more administrative burden on the utility. When to call for that load control, because I guess you could put the load control on the charger as well, and go along with this,
Well, that's
you
what
would
I'm saying,
you would want to cut those completely off, not the cycle.
Right, but just, okay.
Yeah.
Because presumably you want to cut them the same time you want to cut the ACs, right? So it's the same signal, it just goes to two devices in the house now instead of just one.
If I was on time of use, just a side note, like I would be aggressively trying to figure out ways to get more stuff on the load management system. Like, 'cause there's a ton of stuff that could be on there.
And if you're getting paid an incentive to do it.
Yes, like I would aggressively, like, how do I hook up other stuff in my house? How do I make my dishwasher, whatever, like you could imagine a whole list. With regard to the separately metered into the load management system for EV chargers, like how implementable is that? Like if we don't, it's not like you don't need a permit to get an EV charger, right? So how do you even know who they are and how to get people to do this? Like, I think a lot of EV chargers, no one calls the town. You call, maybe an electrician and then you buy it and you plug it in, right? Like we're not involved. So how does this, in theory, it sounds great. In practice, how does this actually work?
If they're getting a 240 volt plug-in, they're supposed to be getting a permit. Now necessarily, are they? Maybe not, but they
So
should.
when the electrician gets a permit, you're like, hold on a second. Why are you getting a 2V or a 240 plug? Is this for an EV charger?
Well, if you're going in the garage, essentially. So
Could we record on new construction to hook it up to it?
that would, I don't know that we would necessarily know about those. Once we have AMI, you'll know who has experience there. I was at a conference recently and they were showing an individual who had lived in the same residence for years. And it was actually a director for a utility, electric utility. For years, their peak had hit was like 2. And as soon as they got an EV, they showed their graph, and it was like 5.5, 6, 5.5, 6, 5.5, 6. I mean, so
There's 11, like the guy I work with just installed 11 kilowatt home chargers. They have 3 movies now.
yeah. So it tripled basically 2.5 to 3 times what their peak had normally been for years and years and years. And it was very, very patterned.
if this is an option for people that are afraid of time constraints, I think you're better off going mandatory. So that kind of goes from handle. They can save money by doing it. So recommend, like I said, my recommendation for you, CP is the most cost-based. I think having a 3-part time, if you consider going to time to use anyways for everyone, sending it to a 3-part incorporates your solar goals and your EV goals.
Yeah.
So I think it makes sense for you. So that's why I didn't get it on too much. Like I said, I do think it should be mandatory opt-out, and then you decide what opt-out characteristics are. But it eliminates the need for end-use rates. You don't have to have an EV rate. It's for everybody. And it's you design it for how your costs are in your system.
And just one comment, when you're looking at this, that CP rate option versus straight time use. The CP rate guarantees that we capture that peak period. If we go to the time of use, there is going to be, electricities, there's occasions where that peak is going to float into a period that we didn't cover.
It'll be in April or October.
It's going to be. It's going to be.
That was the only chart that had them on both ends.
Yeah, and the impact will be significant.
The good news is that those are the lower load months. So it's not quite as impactful as that happening this summer.
Yeah.
Can we set the range dynamic? Like,
You can update it every year, yeah, absolutely, because honestly,
not
the more,
every year, like even every month, for like in the month of April, like our peak load hours are X, right? And so you move them by, an hour or two, like.
I think we can choose when to flip the switch. We can do it right now.
I think they're all predictable. I mean, we've got the charts in the history. We know pretty much when it is 90% of the time. It doesn't change. There's occasions when certain things happen. Something can happen on Duke's system and there could be some crazy event and they're going to end up with peak that just doesn't make any sense. And if we
I
have
was
a
really surprised some of
CP
theirs
rate,
are on Sunday.
Yeah.
Our database.
if we have a
With that
CP rate, we're guaranteed no risk because that's going to correlate. We're going to pick that time. No, 90-something%, we should be okay. There's going to be some occasions where we're going to take it.
But the risk would be pushed to the customer then, like they would have a surprise high bill. And I think it's appropriate for us to take on the risk and mitigate it across all customers. So no one suddenly gets a $500 electrical bill express because Duke had some event on Sunday morning. Could we run it twice a day? Like if we thought, if it's like April 15th and we're like, man, it might be at 8 a.m., it might be at 4 p.m.
Yeah, you can have,
Do it
you
once.
can have shoulder periods for a couple months where it has bifurcated
Yeah.
counties.
And also about this 3 part-time use thing, I'm excited about this. So here's what I think the pitch should be. Like, I think I hope we can do this. Like you have a trial period where the super off-peak rate is free. So they can use, and they can charge overnight for free for like a month or 2 months or 3 months. And then it goes up to 3 cents. It's like an introductory rate, like your, like the Columbia System CD. You get the ones that are like 1 or 2 pennies. And then, eventually they're like $20. And then everyone in town will sign up for it. It'd be like free power, call and do this thing.
Are they bankrupt, Columbia?
Yeah, they are. Yeah. No, they make coffee now. It's fine.
They call me, yeah. Yeah.
We got like 3 more slides.
Let's talk about, so the public EV charges is a little bit different game because instead of a 5 kilowatt home charger, you're talking now getting up into currently in your system 40 something up to 350 kilowatt hours at once. And that's a huge game changer. So we've talked about level 2 chargers. That's most home charging. You can do it just with a dryer outlet, 240 volt connection, 5 to 10 kilowatts. DC fast chargers are known as level 3. This is where you start at about 50 kilowatts. I think you have one of them on your system now. 480 volt 3-phase power. They're going up to like 350 kilowatts at like, big highway corridor fast charging Tesla stations. And they're going to go up from there.
To put this in perspective, if I plug my car into just a plug over here, I add 5 miles every 1 hour. If I plug it into a drive plug or a home charger, I average about 40 miles added on to my range every hour. I go to a Tesla supercharger that's operating at 350 kilowatts. I'm adding around 300 miles every half hour.
So it's like going to the gas station thing.
Right. So if you want to think of it in terms of gas, your most effective and fastest way of filling up your gas tank is with a 350. If you just want to slowly trickle stuff into your gas tank, you use just a regular 110 plug like that. If you want the middle ground, that's where you have what are called level 2 chargers.
Level 3 chargers are also a part of your battery from it, whether it's getting like you're never supposed to charge them above like 80 or 90%. And it'll degrade more over time by having that high, ramp rate. But as people get more EVs, you're going to be traveling more. Most people, really don't need to charge more than at home. But if you travel more, you're going to need that range, and that's where the DC fast chargers. So I want to put, this is where I think it's important to put this in perspective. And this is actually something Eric had me run last year or something. Two 180 kilowatt chargers at Kohl's. And this demonstrates how impactful your CP is. So DC fast chargers in general by the public don't get used very much. They're like 5 to 10% load factors. They just don't. No one uses them. That'll grow over time. They'll get used more. But if you have, your Nekempa bill demand charge, that's what it costs for once you get that demand charge. There's a demand charge piece. That's the energy piece for the month. If both chargers are being used for 30 minutes only at the hour of the CP, the set power supply cost is $7,000, $7,600. That's before any Apex money. That's just your Nekempa bill. And the LGS rate currently would recover $3,700. So, and this also does not include the cost of the charger itself. This assumes someone else is paying for it. This is the power supply cost of serving it. So if you break that into on peak and off peak, the average power supply cost is, right here for that peak demand. Charger rates are typically, this is not atypical, 35 cents a kilowatt hour on peak, like 6 cents an hour off peak. That's why most public chargers charge like 25 to 35 cents a kilowatt hours to cover those demand costs. But this just kind of demonstrates how impactful it is on that CP demand on these higher capacity chargers. And you have to capture that coincident peak in your power supply scenario. So this is analysis of Apex specific chargers. Two here. One of them actually gets used, the Saunders 2 actually gets used quite a bit, but you can see that the other ones are pretty low. This is your DC fast charger. But since this was broken up in on peak and off peak, I said, okay, what if just this one and this one were on peak when someone was charging on peak, what would it cost? And you can see that your power supply cost alone for the average month is $16,000, and you'd have revenue of $4,000. This does not include any customer or distribution costs to serve that load and all your costs to your budget. So you can see that by not having a rate that covers that coincident peak, you're at risk of serious revenue loss. So this is where it becomes more important than the solar situation to get that CP covered. So the options are similar. You could do time of use for public chargers, and this would work, pretty much like this. You could have rates that are just like 35 cents, 40 cents a kilowatt hour for on peak, and it'd be lower off peak. But I mean, whenever someone's using them the on peak, you're covering that cost. When it's a peak demand rate, it makes a ton of sense here to make it cost based. That way, that just links up. If you're using it during the CP, here's the cost. And this is the cost assuming you're not owning them yourselves. It's just someone else's business or someone else puts it in. You can do whatever combination of time of use, energy, and demand charge as well. Or the other one we talked about is load control. And that's it. This is where public chargers tend to probably upset some people. But if you want to give service at a lower rate, just don't make them available during the CP.
Yeah.
Doesn't make people happy.
Yeah.
So it's not as realistic an option.
No, that's not a.
You can make it free for every time.
I still wouldn't do free, but you could do lower rates if you don't allow them to be.
Typically, if someone's using one of our public EV chargers, it's because there's a need for the energy. That's you aren't just plugging in for giggles. You're at a critical battery percentage. That's when you'll use a public EV charger because the rate is so slow there's no advantage to use it. Which is why the two Saunders ones, the reason why they get a lot of traffic is they're behind two restaurants, so you can plug in and hopefully get some form of energy. But at the cost of a normal meal, you're only adding maybe 20 miles over the course of a meal. So anybody's using those is kind of in a position where they're trying to, they're at a critical stage. And I will tell you, as an EV owner, nothing is more frustrating than pulling up to a charger and it's not working.
Yeah.
That is the number one problem. And I think deterrent when it comes to EV charging, the idea that you get there and it's not working. Imagine going to a gas station, you're on E, the light's been on for 30 minutes. You go to the pump and it's like, nah. That's, well, yeah, if you can get to the next, right.
Or next to it. Okay.
My recommendation is, because they have to do utilization and they're a huge financial risk for that demand CP. Level 2 public chargers, you're probably okay with the time of use rate. But the LGS CP rate is preferred. I would mandate any business that has DC fast chargers to be on your CP rate. Set a policy. I think there's so much risk to erode tens of thousands of dollars, in a month by hitting that CP. I think this is one thing I do think it's important that the level 3 ones, you're best off being on a CP, but at a minimum, a time of use rate to try to capture that.
So CP rate, is that just for that 1 hour or is that?
It is, but whatever it's in that thing is that hour changes month to month.
Right.
And you're not going to know when it is. So the time of use rate is easier to explain because you can't necessarily predict. So it would leave the owner, and there would probably have to be Eric, how much do you communicate with the people on the CP rate when it's coming? What's that process like? Is it a phone call? Is it an electronic signal or?
Various, some of them on text,
Yeah.
some of them are.
If you expand the CP rate out, I would think there would be some sort of communication with the customer saying today's likely a CP day. And that tells them to shut down between 4 and 6, not you.
Right, but to Ed's point, right, somebody's pulling up to the charger, right? Like, you gotta display the rate that you're gonna charge these guys, right? So.
But it depends who owns it, because whoever owns the charger is determining the rate, unless it's a public one run by. So.
And that's what we're talking about. Right?
Yeah. So yes, if you control it, then, you might be able to be okay on the level of the time of use rate for level 2. It's probably fine if you wanted to change it throughout the day. You don't really have the control on a lot of things for other people.
Yeah, so, but, I plug in at, 10 minutes before 8, right? And then also at 8 o'clock, my rate changes, right? And I come back and I see a bill that I wasn't expecting.
Yeah.
Right, like, how do you explain that?
I think you would have the time periods on the charger. You would have to have it, not just what it is right now, but what it is throughout the day. That's going to stay stable through seasonally. But those time periods don't change month to month. You can actually show the rates for each time period. So.
What we're talking about is the billing plan for a meter that feeds like private EV chargers, right? Like, it's not public ones, we do whatever we want, but the private ones, if some company decides to install a bank of EV chargers in a Target parking lot, and they work out some deal, like, what do we charge them?
Yeah.
They can charge them right. And how they pass it on to the customers is actually beyond our control.
Exactly.
But certainly,
That was the point.
we would incentivize them to charge a much higher rate during peak hours as well.
Yeah, that was it. Right, I'm along with that.
I think we asked enough questions along the way. Is there any decision that needs to be made?
Yeah.
Just information only right now.
Did you guys want to try that 3-tier time of use policy? Like, I wouldn't want to make it mandatory, but there's nothing stopping us from rolling it out before.
There wasn't necessarily anything coming out of it for this year. I think you could start a pilot program this year. We could design that rate, easily scale it up what you do now. One thing I would think you should consider is the concept of not having a minimum bill of 25 and not being able to erode in a single month below that on your solar customer. customer bills.
So those are kind of the decisions that I need for the budget, to look at budget, because right now, what was presented at the joint committee, which, well, let's see how we're at. But basically, at a minimum, we're looking at a 4% increase for electric. At a minimum, because we know we're getting 3% coming as a pass-through from NECMPA, and then we've got, inflation on operations and then increased personnel costs, right? So we already know at a very minimum, we're gonna have 4%. So that was one of the things that we've talked about with Craig is, we're tying our rate models together to show basically, hey, depending on what we do here is obviously gonna impact what we have to do to our residential rates, like you saw. So one of those things is, hey, are we looking at having the set $25 charge so that everybody pays to cover distribution, some of those fixed costs or distribution costs? Is that you can't go negative, like 100% negative, right?
For the year, yeah, basically. Because you could be under 1 month, it would roll over to the next month. So say you're positive 700 1 month, negative 600.
AMI to do that as well? So roll over.
That's in our billing system.
Yeah, but it might have to be a manual process.
It is right now. That's been the issues. It's a manual process. So when it was 100, it's one thing. Now it's 800.
Yeah.
Now it's growing. That's part of the reason switching our ERP is that our current system just does not have the it doesn't have. We can't do anything that complex. It's not sophisticated enough to do what we wanted to do.
Okay, so there are several decisions. We're gonna do them one at a time here, possibly. Okay. The first $25 one, is that on the table? Okay.
I'll start.
To make.
Or no. Like, again, the policies, I don't want to ever be worse than Duke, and this would be worse than Duke. So, no. Once Duke makes that change, huh?
Our rates are still better than Duke.
Yes, but I mean, on a policy perspective, this is not something Duke does. So we would then have a worse deal than Duke on this point, and that's not my favorite.
Dearborn, so say, and we haven't finished the financial forecast yet. I'm working back to Casey right now. Say it's a 4% rate increase for the system. And understand the cost of service study from last year that said residential is, at the time, showed the need for a 5.5% increase on a 2% system average. How much more, or should the residential get more than 4%? And should the LGS and larger classes get 0 or less than 7%?
And also, one of the things you talked about last year is building our cash on reserve or our days.
Cash on hand.
That's going to factor into what the overall rate increase needs to be. So, yeah.
Right, but that's part of this whole, you had, I think, suggested last year 90 days, I believe.
And 90 days is low. I try to get everyone to.
And we're substantially less than that right now.
To me, sounds like a lot of numbers and forecasts. Is there something you can build that we can look at? And then we can come back.
Yeah, like, because we're making, like, we haven't seen the budget, we haven't seen the rate impacts, we're trying to make a decision on $25.
And that 4% rate increase is a 3% pass through from our costs going, our supplier going up, and then us raising our rates 1%. That's really good. And they were rent. Like, to me, that's amazing that we can do that. So
Which would be that would be the best case scenario. Just to, I reiterated that a couple of times. That would be the best case scenario.
I do want to say this we got a subject matter expert in the room who's telling us, and again, I want to be, I want to compliment solar users, but when we talk about the demand of this, are we going to listen, or are we just going to see it just go in a direction that we think is right, and we're not factoring all Apex residents? I just want to make sure we look at that.
So I would say I am listening, and we've had this conversation before, not you and me and him, and me and Marty, and me and Sean, me and Eric. And I understand what's going on here, and I am listening. And like I said earlier, I am willing to consider incremental changes as they impact us, which we've finally, for the first time today, quantified to a dollar amount. Like, as that grows, and it's going to grow over time, I don't want it to grow too large. I don't want people without solar to have a 10% surcharge because they don't have solar versus someone else. That's not fair. So I am willing to view changes. Again, come back to Duke. The fact that they're changing their policies in a couple of years and they're going through that process, we have an opportunity to look at what they're doing, learn from them, even maybe model after them. And as I said earlier, if they're going to a time of use, I'm willing to go to a time of use as well over time. And if we can change behaviors with the time of use, that's going to be a win-win for everyone. Be a win-win for Apex because our costs will go down if that's actually implemented properly. Customers' bills will be less accordingly. Solar users, that solar subsidies percentage will go down because, you know, like the way they're compensated will be different because of time of use, and that'll impact that. And that to me seems like the long-term solution.
So if I can just, one thing just to keep in mind, there is really no relationship between our rates and how Duke does business. Their business model has absolutely nothing to do with ours. It's totally different. Their drivers on why and what they do don't exist here. Their financial benefits and how they come with their rates is totally separate. I know we try to stay equitable with them as far as the rate from a citizen perspective, but the drivers that force them to make decisions don't apply here anywhere. So I know there's always this, hey, you know, what does Duke do? Duke does things for financial reasons because they're driven by a whole lot of other things that we have nothing to do with. And so when I hear that, well, Duke is doing this, their financial picture, they could reduce rates and make more money because of something they're being, you know, their solar policy is based on the fact they were mandated to put it in. It's cheaper for them to have the customer put it in than it is for them, and they take credit for it. So, you know, when they turn around and they say they're solar friendly, they're not. They're business friendly because they're being mandated to do that, and they're earning return on it. And when we try to sit there and we try to make our policies look like theirs, we don't have those drivers. We're not getting compensated. So behind the scenes, when you start sitting there, you know, I think in average, we could keep our rates somewhere in line. Right now, we're 13% cheaper than Duke's residential rates. We're 13% cheaper, and we buy all of our bulk power from them. That should ring a bell that something's not right. That we're not in line if we're 13% cheaper than right. So they're going
I think they
straight
just
up.
filed for a 16% base rate increase.
Yes.
And they have relief valves in their rates through fuel adjustment clauses. So, you know, you see their rate, but you don't see the behind the scenes when they're adding all these additional things on their bills. There's
Well,
cost.
they also have additional riders as well.
So let me be clear. When I compare us to Duke, it's not because I'm trying to make an argument that Duke is making certain decisions due to certain circumstances. And if they're making that decision, it's good for us as well. I understand that their model is different. I actually don't care what their motivation is. The reason I say that and what actually matters is what our citizens see or would see if they were on Duke. The comparison to Duke is purely about 100% about the bill that a citizen gets and what that number is. And if they had Duke as a provider, what that number would be. And if our number isn't lower than Duke's number, then we shouldn't be a public utility. And we shouldn't have like the vast majority of the stuff we're doing. Then we're just wasting our customers' money. Like we have to provide better service at lower cost, or at least roughly the same cost to justify the existence of most of your department. So I'm making that comparison, not because of a business case. I'm saying I want to make sure we're doing better because that's why we have a public utility. And if we're not doing better, why are we here?
Are we headed in that direction?
We are much better than Duke right now, yes. And I want to stay much better than Duke in every respect.
If we continue to go in direction, which is sure we are. I really love, as a longtime Apex resident, having our own electric utilities. Like, I really love that. And it sounds to me that if we continue to go in the direction we're going to lose out on that.
I won't let that happen. Like if we get to the point where we're worse than Duke, I will make changes to make sure we're better than Duke, or I will say we shouldn't have a public power utility.
Frankly, the way that your position on this electric thing has made me skeptical that we should continue, frankly, as a utility.
Why?
Because the minus dollars. I've gotten increasingly concerned about the way you talk, and Duke is maybe a better choice in the end, in the long term, the way we're heading. So I'm not sure you're saying it that way. That's why I started. I have increasingly felt that way hearing what you've been saying, that we should just
Well, I'm sorry to hear that. What I said earlier is the way the current level of subsidy is today, I'm comfortable with it, but I am uncomfortable as it grows, and I'm willing to consider changes, particularly time of use changes, as that continues to grow. And I'd like to keep an eye on what that number is exactly. Like, that's what I said earlier. So that was meant, I was trying to communicate that I am willing to change it in the future. I think today, April 18th, 2023, I don't think we have a problem, but I do see that, yes, as the adoption grows, it becomes a
Yeah,
problem.
and that curve is exponential, not linear even, way more than population growth. The way I see that curve.
And then forecasting, budget. And I know we think of long term, but when it comes to building a budget, people are suffering right now. I'm getting a lot of calls. Is there going to be a tax increase? Is there going to be a electric increase? Like, all those numbers add up, man. And everybody can't afford that. So I want to make some adjustments some way.
So can we vote on the 25 or start voting on this stuff? I mean, I'm ready to have some votes for this year's budget.
So
I think we decided we want to.
what is the impact? So listen, I feel like the $25 is meaningless unless we know what the budget
Right.
impact of that is, right? And so I'm still like, I'm hearing a number here, I'm hearing a number here, but I don't hear everything in context. And so what is that $25 minimum bill going to do for us? What does it help? What is the offset on a potential rate increase? But we need to have a complete conversation here and not just about whether $25 is still a good number or not.
And I think that's what we suggested is to amend the bills, build that.
Yeah.
What's right.
So so if I'm hearing you correctly, you want to understand what is the fixed cost rate per customer,
Yes.
to understand how that covers our fixed cost for the utility. And then, so that's one thing, but the other thing I do want to mention that I forgot about is that right now, until we get the new ERP, we can't really just charge that fixed rate because our system just does the credit to the bill without us being able to wall that off.
So it might,
So if we get
it might be
that way,
to vote on that.
So right now it's a moot point until hopefully next year.
So, right, no, listen, a system where your bill rolls backwards, but the credits carry over month over month. And then at the end of the year, they all drop in April or something, is what Duke has today, right? Like, that's not what we do, but we could adopt that system and still, would be equal or better than Duke. But what's being proposed, like, if I understand it, it's just a $25 minimum bill.
I
Right?
think, but the credits would roll over, so you're not gonna be negative. Yes, that would impact a customer that's negative every month. Most likely customers are way negative some months or positive in some months. And so that would offset to where you're not. If you're negative every month, yes, that would.
So that doesn't sound as bad, right? Like the rollover system, like that's basically what Duke had before they're moving to this, right?
It would only impact customers if they're net negative the entire year.
We can't do the rollover side.
Until we get the ERP.
And we need to do the ERP anyway, so
Something to plan ahead for then.
Yeah.
yes, like once we have the new system, we can then do a system where there's a minimum charge and the credits that can't be applied because your minimum charge will roll over.
But the conversation I'd like to have is, okay, so we're looking at a 4% increase on the electric rates right
Minimum.
now, right?
Sorry.
If we do this $25 minimum, how were we implemented? Now we're looking at a 3% increase. Okay, now I understand what the offset is, or, we can keep it at 4%, otherwise it's gonna be 6%, right? So like, we gotta understand what the impact is of.
I don't think that would have been, that's more like less erosion. I think the more important question for today is, are you willing to go above the system average for residents based on cost of service? Does that make sense? Do I need to explain that again?
Yeah.
So the cost of service study, which tells you relative to your system average, what each class's share of that revenue requirement is. You're at 2% last year, it showed the need for residential to get 5.5%, so more than twice the system average. Large general and large CP were like negative 10%. They're way above their cost. And I think what we did last year is we froze LGS and LGS CP, gave SGS 2%, and gave residential 2.59%. Doesn't make a difference.
So
My suggestion is.
yeah, but basically what we did was we found that the large service was subsidizing residential. So we're trying to kind of offset that so that the different classes, right, or the different types of service were doing cost recovery. So, and that's like some of the rates and stuff that we looked at finance committee had those large general services frozen, because the other increases basically would make up the rate, the revenue rate, because they're already overcompensating.
And this spread's gonna get worse the more so we get our system. So that's what I'm saying. If it was me, usually what we'll do is we'll cap it as a percentage of the system average, usually like say 150%. So if the system average is 4%, residential would go to 6% increase. And LGS would be not or less. But these are the decisions you're gonna have to make as this expands, because that differential with residential is gonna get bigger over time if you're only making tiny changes relative to the system.
So to be clear though, like that's a different thing than what we were just talking about, what the mayor was just talking about. So there's a concern about some residential customers subsidizing other residents. That being inequitable. What percentage of that? You looked at the numbers.
So I think that's part of this though, because
Yeah, so let me finish. So, but what you're talking about now is about large commercial customers and the degree they're subsidizing residential, like recovering costs. And should that be more equitable? And my answer is, I think it's good that they're subsidizing residential. Cause like, let's keep doing that. So yeah, like we shouldn't freeze the large ones. They should have a 4% increase. Residential should be a 4% increase across the board. The philosophy that, you know, some people have where the cost recovery across the different categories should be proportional to, you know, what it costs them. I don't share that. I'm glad that the residential customers are being subsidized to a certain degree by our larger customers. And as long as large customers are getting a better deal than Duke, and I'm gonna bring that up again, but like, that's important to me. Like if they're getting a better deal than Duke but just our residents are getting a betterer deal than Duke, like that's good. Like I like that. So I don't from you know, an abstract perspective, I don't feel the need to make sure that our large customers are recovering, like you know, that they have a more equitable distribution. I think it's fine the way it is.
And I share that sentiment, right? But to me, that seems to have a much larger impact on the balance of the budget than freezing or like having a $25 minimum, right? So that's why I'm like, I can sit here and say, yeah, $25 minimum, like no problem, right? But to what effect?
When it's
Right?
3%.
What are the other levers? Like, what are we not talking about yet today?
So
that may potentially have a much larger.
I'll make one more point on the $25 thing, and I promise I'll move off of it. Again, this is a philosophical thing. Like, I don't want to change the deal that people who bought solar panels already have. Like they've made a large capital investment, which is assumed a certain policy and a certain payback period over a certain number of years. That didn't factor in having a minimum charge of $25. Like that rolling the meter backwards during the high peak months and then, you know, paying during the winter and summer months is what they anticipated doing. And for us to put a flat $25 fee on existing solar customers, I think is problematic because I think it's.
But even if we
lengthens their
time
return
of
on
use,
investment, right? That's the big thing.
we're gonna roll back.
It's a matter of they got a certain deal. Like it's changing the deal that someone already had.
Say 11 versus 10 years, right?
We got a minute.
So just real quick, because I know, I mean, I get what you're saying. I hear what you're saying. In terms of large general service, I mean, you're talking about less than 20 customers. So when you're talking about, like, that's fine for them to subsidize that. You're talking about, you know, 24,000 residential customers. You're talking about less than 20 large general.
They're not subsidizing anything.
so if you're coming to where you
Yeah.
freeze them and then the
It's-
Definitely not.
residential.
It's not gonna,
But like what?
it's not.
Give me numbers, like, you know, like how many million dollars are we talking?
So I
Well, see,
think-
this is where it's a zero sum game. This is once you set the budget. I'm sorry.
I was just gonna say, I think part of your question is because like we presented some information to the finance committee that hasn't been presented to the entire board. Because, and you'll get more of that on May 5th. So we can, I think there's kind of like 3 things that we need to talk about. One is this rate between the LGS customers and residential. The other is the $25, which is a moot discussion right now, but we can come back at a later time to give you more information about what that looks like because we don't have the ERP in place. And then what was the third one that I just said?
Solar EV, like the
And-
solar,
and
and
the
the impact of the solar.
Right, and the impact of the solar. And I think that's also a future discussion. So I think for today, the biggest thing is the impact on the budget, which is something that we'll have more discussion on May 5th, correct? Because I think some of it is that you haven't had that other budget discussion because it's been in a finance committee meeting. So there's some information that you're missing.
And so Okay,
It's
So-
helpful for us if we know what it is that what
So,
information do you need in order to make
here's
this
what
decision,
I want, like,
so we can bring it.
Eric needs X million dollars next year, right? Here's what he's going to collect based on current conditions, current assumptions on solar use, whatever, right? Here are the levers that we have to make Eric whole, right? We can think of it rates, we can think of it a minimum fee, we can think of it, the balance between large and customers and residential, right? Then we can have a conversation, it's okay, how are we gonna close the gap that we're seeing, right? Just having one specific conversation about one specific rate without all the other numbers in play, I'm not ready to make a call on that, like, because I'm just not, I don't have the information I need to make an informed decision.
And I think that's why, that's the component of the budget retreat, where we'll get a chance to basically rustle this out and compare not only with electrical, utilities, stormwater, personnel, all those other things. They're all gonna come into play. So I know that's gonna be a bigger part. I know Amanda, Sean have been working hard on trying to be able to come up with how they can budget the numbers to be able to tell us, in order for us to make this happen, these are the options that we get. So we know we're gonna get options. Katie, I would ask if you could also place on there a fourth issue, which is, it seems as though there's a consistent tone within the council for making sure that those who have the least amount in means have some form of a life raft. So we may want recommendations, policy recommendations in terms of how do we provide either assistance options or, opt-out options, or kind of like with the stormwater, what do things look like when we have tiers 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, but take away 1 because we're going to rely on the additional revenue from 5. Because I know equity is a big component of what's the conversation here, and trying to figure out how do we not leave behind the least of us. So.
Would you all be amenable to us splitting up that conversation? Because part of that is, we still have to make this.
Right, no, that's why I say it's like this. I think it's gonna have to come with, as we're talking about the levers for the budget, which numbers go which way, then once that's set,
And then we can.
we're gonna.
But there's two sides to the slice, right? There's the income and there's the expense, right? And so so you guys have done a ton of work with rolling up the kind of the bottoms up expense forecast, right? I have not seen that, right? Maybe some of my colleagues have. I have no idea. If Eric says I need another 100 people, right, then that's, that affects my expense number, right? Do we at some point get to challenge, do you really need 100 people or do you need 50 people, right? Because right now we're just talking about increasing the revenue side, right? How about managing the cost side, right? Like, we haven't had that conversation yet.
Well, I
The
think-
Personnel and Finance Committee has.
Well, the number we got was 1% increase in operating costs, right? Year over year,
For the electric.
electric.
Oh, so it's higher than that. But what we did reduce substantially expenditures and looked at, okay, what is it that we need? What do we need to plan for? But then also you're looking at like inflation. When you're talking about position requests, I mean, you're talking about, okay, well, we're gonna look at expanding for a specific crew for a specific purpose. So part of that justification kind of falls into play as the recommendations. Hey, here's what's needed for operating. So when we look at it, we're saying, hey, here's our personnel costs, here's the increases for different programs, benefits, whatever else. Operating, hey, these are different things like services that we're adding, like a Yukon.
I'm good with all that, right? And so maybe I'm just the odd man out that is not part of the finance committee, has not seen any of this, right? My observation from today's conversation is that I'm being asked to make decisions based on partial and incomplete information. I cannot do that, right? Either you give me the full package and then ask me to make a recommendation, or count me out, right, as part of the vote, because I'm not going to sit here and say, yeah, this is fine, or this is not good. And because I don't understand the complete impact on the residents. And then so I'm frustrated, right? Because I'm feeling I'm not getting the information needed to make a proper budget decision.
So, and I think part of it too is that this work session technically is not part of our budget process. It's just part of our work session, the work sessions that we had scheduled to circle back around on discussions that we started last year around the rates. And so I think because it's in the middle of the budget process, that's part of the frustration. So.
But we're treating it as a budget means, right? Amanda sits there and it's like, hey, I would like to, because I'd like to model this out in the budget, which I understand, right? And that makes total sense, but then you gotta give us all the information to make that decision and not just $25. What are we gonna do with $25?
So part of this is just geared, so this part of the rate study, the evaluation, basically what was directed by council previously was we need to look at solar, the impact of solar and the impact of like the EV charging, because we're seeing obviously that huge uptick. And so it has this potential. So that's kind of to Mr. Mahaffey's point. He says, well, okay, well, this is what we're looking for. We're looking for this number. Where is our, and basically what we're asking is what's that pain point at which we're no longer going to do this solar subsidy, right? Is it at that 10% mark? So it's not, we're not asking for necessarily, hey, we need to vote on these different things. What we're trying to do is get some direction. Well, what I'm trying to do is get some direction in terms of budget, because you guys are getting a draft budget this week. So that'll go to you. So I want to make sure that you all have the information, the questions that you have, the information that you want to see, so that you can look at that, so that when we go in on the May 5th, you're able to say, okay, we had information, we're prepared for discussion. And so
But I think the challenge is that we're having two, so one, we're following up on information that you all requested last year. And then secondly, we're following up on, we're asking questions at our follow-up from the Finance and Personnel Committee meeting, which Councilman Gant and you were not a part of. So that's why it feels like you're missing some information, because you don't have the previous discussion or the discussion. Of the previous
So I'm getting the policy type decisions that, okay, so here's information, here's the future impact on solar, here's the future impact on EV charge of EV chargers, and we need to develop collectively a viewpoint around how we're going to deal with that, right? Which is entirely appropriate.
I thought we did. Like, I thought we all kind of started to nod when we talked about the time of use and moving towards that.
Right, and that's fine. Like, but then we're following it up with, okay, what are we going to do with this $25? Like, okay, that's a very different conversation.
So the way that we used to do these things, it used to be in a day and a half of a budget retreat, where we would all combine all this information into that day and a half, and we would make decisions based on that, policy and budget related. It becomes untenable when we have all of this information, all these budget policy changes that we have to make. So spreading it out like this is better for everybody, that we don't have to spend a day and a half analyzing all this stuff all at once. So to me, this is not about giving you the feedback you need. It's about, okay, let's see what our policy is. Let's see, give us the information that we need, and give us the study information, so that we can kind of in the background think about what direction we want to head whenever we get those direct budget requests. That, okay, now based on this background information, let's make these direct decisions. So I think that information, the detailed information that you're looking for, will come in the next budget session that we have, but it's going to be based on some of this background information we just talked about. So yeah, it used to be a lot all at once, and spreading it out like this makes it a little easier.
Okay. And again, I'm not part of the Finance Committee or the Personnel Committee, so I'm missing a piece here, right? That's clearly you guys have discussed. You guys have already vetted the new positions, or did some of the documentation. I've not seen any of that, right? So based on that type of information, I'm just saying, I don't know what to do with what you're asking me for.
And that's reasonable. That's reasonable.
Yeah, I don't think we're at the point where we need to start asking. I mean, generally, the meetings that we've had in the past are helping to refine issues, so that as we have a larger discussion, stormwater being a great example. One of the things that we were presented last week for stormwater was, they presented the options. The question was, do we need to present this to the larger body? And those two committees, we said, yeah, that'd be a good idea. It'd help us out. It would help us out, as well as providing the options for option one, which was presented at that previous meeting. We said, could you also give us what option two is? And that would give us a little bit more formulaic idea of what we're looking at. Ultimately, you know, the issue is still got to be addressed when we get into the budget issue, into the budget meeting. But this gives us a little bit more of a heads up and a little bit more of a head start because, you know, I remember sitting here last year going, oh, wait, I didn't realize we had limitations on stormwater, on the stormwater fund usage. I didn't realize that until we got into the meetings, and that was good to know.
Listen, let's move on. Like, do we need to make a decision on something here, or are we good right now?
Yeah, so let's, I think what we're hearing, what I'm hearing, and so if I'm, correct me if I'm incorrect, but from the policy decision, we have an idea, like, we're hearing about the time of use, some general things. What the $25 is actually, if you said it's a new point right now, but until we have the ERP in place, till we have the NMI in place, it's not. So the policy decisions, I think we're heading in a direction, we kind of have that. None of that's going to take place for the budget this year. We don't have the systems in place. It's not there, but this does allow us time to build out. And that's what Craig and Amanda are gathering. Some of this is we can build out what they want. It gives Eric time to help us plan, you know, where we're going to go, helps them plan our future budget. Immediately what I'm hearing is basically it's really, we're going to have the same rate structure. We're not changing our rate structures this year. The rates themselves may need to change. We will have that. You will get that this week. We're not changing the rate structure. It'll just be what do you want to see on the rates. And just like anything else, we'll give you, hey, here's the average impact on the resident. Here's what it looks like. And then you can decide if that's too much or not enough.
Can I also request too that the next time we have a discussion about solar or any changes, that we also talk about the policy changes, that we could talk about like the silent system and things like that, that we could also add in as possible limitations.
The whole program needs to be, I think we're trying to build out the whole program here. We do need to address all those policy decisions too. Because to Mr. Zarin's point, there's a lot of different factors that got to piece together to decide on what this future model looks like. And to set that future model rate, we need to know what model we're going to use.
But I think part of the exercise here is scenario planning, right? What if we go to a time of use model versus a whatever incidental fee model, right? What kind of different decisions does that drive, or what kind of different financials are we looking at under those conditions, right? And then, you know, we can make the impact analysis. Okay, what's the most beneficial for our residents, or at least the least hurtful for our residents,
and that's
right? Based on some of these different scenarios, right? And so this was a great presentation. I learned a lot, right? So appreciate the overview, and thanks for letting me catch up a little bit. But now the next step to me is like, okay, now that we have all these variables in play, right, let's just start running some scenarios and understand, like, you know, how far does the spread between our time of use rates need to be if we go version 1 versus version 2, or, you know, that's more what I'd be looking for, right? And then, you know, that way you can start weaving the budget decisions into the policy conversation.
Agreed.
Okay. Thank you. Sounds good. All right. You good? Mr. Brown, thank you for your job.
Thank you.
Yeah.
See you next year.
Mr. Lumen, thank you, sir.
It'll be before then.
And the other thing I could often use, once we get the financial forecast model updated, I can do a live screen share where we run scenarios on what the rate increase needs to be. So if you can just.
Sounds like that'd be something you guys are.
Okay, we're done with the regular business session.
Was there somebody that's
For that.
Right, ready to go. You don't want to do the all-day budget session? Not having fun?
maybe the one after that? Evening? Okay. Well, she prefers this evening.
Okay, that's fine. It'll be brief anyway.
Okay.
Yeah, we're gonna do that.
I was if you're not gonna be here.
That's right.
Yeah, right, okay.
Yeah. Let's go ahead and make a motion. Is there a motion?
Closed session.
All right, motion.
Second.
Seconds, everybody. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Motion passes.